Hello there, and welcome to Secretum Histories. Tonight we are settling into a question that quietly sits beneath almost everything we think we know about the ancient world, even though it is rarely addressed directly. We often speak about the birth of civilization as if it were a clearly marked event, a moment where humanity stepped forward out of obscurity and into history. We imagine a first city, a first law, a first written word, a clean starting line separating prehistory from civilization. But when we turn to the oldest written records humanity ever produced, when we listen carefully to the voices preserved in clay by Sumerian scribes more than 5,000 years ago, something unexpected happens. The beginning we expect to find simply is not there. If you find this kind of slow exploration calming or absorbing, you can like the video and subscribe. It helps the channel continue, and it lets more people find these quiet journeys into the deep past. For now, allow the pace to slow, the outside world to recede slightly, and the story to unfold in its own time. The Sumerian records do not open with discovery. They do not describe humanity learning to farm for the first time, or building its first shelter, or inventing writing through trial and error. They do not show civilization stumbling forward uncertainly, making mistakes, experimenting, improving. Instead, they begin as if civilization is already in place. Cities exist, temples are standing, kings rule, laws function, agriculture operates. Writing appears fully formed, not introduced as new technology, but used confidently to record offerings, transactions, hymns, and royal authority. The texts speak as though something essential has already happened before the story begins, something so foundational that it does not need explanation. This absence is not accidental. It is consistent, widespread, and remarkably stable across centuries of Sumerian writing. Whether one is reading administrative records, mythological compositions, royal inscriptions, or cosmological hymns, the pattern repeats. The world is already organized, human society already functions, divine authority is already established. Even the gods themselves often act as though the structure of existence predates the narratives being told. The records do not move from chaos to order. They begin inside order. This creates a tension that modern readers often overlook. We are accustomed to histories that explain origins. We expect causes to be laid out clearly. We expect beginnings to be marked, celebrated, or at least described. The Sumerian texts do something different. They assume continuity. They treat civilization not as an invention but as an inheritance, not as a fragile experiment, but as a system that has already settled into place. When modern historians speak of the Sumerians as the first civilization, this is largely a classification applied retroactively. It reflects the archaeological record as we currently understand it, not the self-understanding of the people who lived there. The Sumerians did not describe themselves as inventors of civilization. They did not claim to be the first to build cities or to organize society. They wrote as people who had received civilization, who were maintaining it, preserving it, and operating within boundaries that already existed. This distinction matters. It changes how the texts must be read. If we approach them expecting an origin story, we will be disappointed or tempted to fill the silence with speculation. If we instead treat the silence itself as meaningful, a different picture emerges. The records are not incomplete, they are selective. They are structured around what mattered most to the scribes who preserved them. One of the most striking features of early Sumerian writing is how confidently it presents authority. Kingship does not arise from conflict or negotiation. It descends. Laws are not debated or invented. They are established. Temples are not experimental structures. They are central institutions connected to divine presence. Even work itself, from farming to construction, is described as something already understood, already governed by ritual, already embedded in cosmic order. The Sumerians lived in a world where memory carried more weight than innovation. Knowledge was not something to be discovered for the first time, but something to be remembered correctly. This is reflected in the way scribes were trained. Writing was not treated as a creative art. It was a discipline. Students copied older texts repeatedly, sometimes for years, preserving exact wording and structure. Variation was discouraged. Accuracy mattered more than originality. This approach to knowledge leaves little room for stories about beginnings. To describe an origin would be to imply uncertainty or improvisation. Instead, the texts emphasize continuity. They describe how things are meant to function, how they have always functioned, and what happens when that order is disrupted. Even disasters like floods are framed not as beginnings but as resets, interruptions that restore a balance that existed before. When the Sumerian king list begins, it does not open with humanity organizing itself or choosing leaders. It opens with kingship descending from heaven. Authority is already complete when it arrives. The first kings rule for spans of time that stretch far beyond human experience. These reigns are not realistic in a biological sense, but they are meaningful symbolically. They signal a different condition of existence, a time when the boundary between divine and human was thinner, when governance itself was closer to the source of order. The list does not explain how kingship was invented, because invention is not the point. Kingship is presented as a cosmic principle. It exists independently of human effort. Humans receive it and exercise it temporarily. When a flood occurs, kingship does not disappear forever. It descends again. The structure remains intact even when the population changes. This same pattern appears in Sumerian creation narratives. Humanity is not created at the beginning of existence. The world already exists. The gods already labour. Cities already have meaning. Humans are introduced as a solution to an existing problem. Their role is defined immediately. They are made to maintain something that is already in motion. This framing avoids the question of a true beginning. The texts are not concerned with the first moment of awareness or the first spark of social organisation. They focus instead on function. What exists is evaluated by what it does. Order is measured by stability, not novelty. The absence of a clear starting point may also reflect the Sumerian relationship with time itself. Time in these texts is not always linear. It moves in cycles. Floods erase and restore, dynasties rise and fall, cities are abandoned and rebuilt. What matters is not when something first occurred, but whether it aligns with cosmic order now. Archaeologically, this perspective aligns with what excavations reveal. The earliest urban layers at sites like Uruk and Eridu do not show a slow transition from scattered villages to complex cities. Instead, they often reveal rapid organisation, standardised building techniques, administrative systems and economic planning. From the moment writing appears, it is already sophisticated. Numerical systems are complex, accounting practices are precise, religious institutions are established. This has long puzzled researchers. Writing does not appear as a crude experiment. It appears as a working system. Agriculture does not appear as tentative. It appears as organised production. Social hierarchy does not emerge gradually in the texts. It is assumed. The Sumerian records reflect this reality not by explaining it, but by bypassing it. They begin where stability already exists. They record transactions, prayers, laws and myths that operate within a world that feels complete. This completeness does not mean the Sumerians believed nothing came before. On the contrary, their myths reach back into deep time. They describe primordial waters, early divine generations, and cosmic separations. But even these narratives do not function as historical beginnings in the modern sense. They are not timelines. They are frameworks. They establish relationships, domains, and responsibilities, not sequences of invention. The primordial state is not a human past. It is a cosmic condition. Humanity enters late, already shaped by structures that predate it. Civilization, in this view, is not something humans gradually assemble. It is something that emerges once the cosmos itself is ordered enough to sustain it. This perspective reframes silence as intention. The Sumerian scribes were not forgetting their origins. They were writing within a worldview that did not prioritize origins as explanations. What mattered was alignment with order, respect for inherited systems, and preservation of balance between gods, humans, and the environment. In this sense, civilization did not need a beginning story because it was never understood as a human creation alone. To describe its origin would be to claim ownership over something believed to be received. The texts preserve roles, not inventions. They document stewardship, not discovery. As the narrative continues, this silence becomes more revealing. Each time the texts refer to ancient times, they do so indirectly. They speak of earlier kings, earlier cities, earlier divine decisions, but rarely of the first instance of anything. The past recedes smoothly, without a sharp edge where everything begins. This approach encourages a different kind of listening. Instead of searching for a starting point, it invites attention to structure, how things are arranged, how authority flows, how memory is preserved, how order is repaired when it breaks. The Sumerian records are not incomplete histories waiting to be finished. They are complete expressions of a worldview that understood civilization as something already underway, something older than any single generation, something maintained rather than invented. As we move forward, this absence will continue to shape everything else, the way cities are described, the way gods behave, the way disasters are framed, the way humanity is positioned within the cosmos. The silence at the beginning is not a gap. It is a foundation that supports everything that follows, quietly, steadily, without needing to announce itself. The impression of completeness is one of the most striking and unsettling features of the Sumerian record. When the earliest tablets are read carefully, without projecting modern expectations onto them, the world they describe does not feel like a civilization in its infancy. It feels settled, not static, not unchanging, but already structured in a way that suggests long familiarity rather than recent discovery. The cities are not experiments, they are functioning systems. The institutions described are not tentative, they operate with confidence, as though their legitimacy no longer needs justification. From the very first administrative tablets, which record grain distributions, labour assignments, temple offerings, and livestock counts, there is an assumption that everyone involved understands their role. The scribes do not explain why grain is stored, why labour is organised, or why offerings are made to specific gods. These practices are already normalised. The writing exists to manage complexity, not to introduce it. Writing does not emerge as a tool being tested. It appears as a necessity already woven into daily life. This creates a subtle but important problem for anyone trying to locate a beginning. A civilization that appears already complete cannot be traced backward through its own records to a moment of formation, because the records themselves only exist once that formation has already occurred. Writing arrives too late to describe the transition from non-civilization to civilization. But in the Sumerian case, the silence goes deeper than that. Even mythological texts, which could have served as symbolic origin stories, do not attempt to fill this gap in the way later cultures would. Instead of stories about humans inventing agriculture, Sumerian texts describe agriculture as something already governed by divine order. Instead of narrating the first city being founded, they speak of cities as established places with assigned gods and sacred roles. Instead of tracing the development of law, they present laws as reflections of cosmic justice, administered by kings who rule by divine sanction. The sense of completeness extends beyond material culture into social structure. Hierarchies are already in place. There are kings, priests, scribes, labourers, merchants, and craftsmen. Each role is defined. Each has obligations. The texts do not describe the emergence of these roles, they describe their operation. This suggests that, from the perspective of the scribes, these structures were not innovations worth recording. They were the normal state of the world. Even conflict is treated as something that occurs within an established system rather than disrupting it. Disputes are resolved through courts. Wars are framed as contests between already legitimate powers. Rebellions are deviations, not catalysts for new social forms. The underlying framework remains intact. One might expect that religious texts would preserve a memory of a simpler time, a pre-civilized past when humans lived closer to nature and gradually learned to organize themselves. But the Sumerian myths do not do this either. Humans appear already differentiated from animals, already capable of labor, already integrated into a divine economy of work and worship. They are not portrayed as learning these roles through experience. They are assigned these roles at creation. This portrayal reinforces the impression that civilization, as a way of life, was not perceived as fragile or recent. It was seen as the correct condition of humanity. Disorder was the anomaly. Chaos was something that existed before order or returned during catastrophe, but not something humans naturally inhabited for long. Archaeology supports this textual impression in a surprising way. The earliest urban centres in southern Mesopotamia show a level of planning and coordination that is difficult to reconcile with a slow, incremental rise from small villages. Large-scale irrigation systems appear early. Monumental architecture emerges quickly. Standardized building techniques spread across wide regions. Economic networks connect distant settlements. This does not mean that development was instantaneous, but it does suggest that, by the time the Sumerians began writing, the most transformative shifts had already occurred. Writing captures a civilization in motion, not in formation. The texts reflect that reality by focusing on maintenance rather than invention. The completeness of the civilization also appears in how time is handled. Sumerian records are deeply concerned with continuity. Kings trace their legitimacy through lists that stretch far into the past. Temples are rebuilt on the same sacred sites repeatedly, each reconstruction presented as a renewal rather than a replacement. Ritual calendars follow cycles that are treated as ancient and binding. There is little interest in marking a first instance. Instead, there is a preoccupation with correct repetition. Doing things the way they have always been done matters more than knowing who did them first. This attitude shapes the record. Origins become less important than preservation. The language itself reflects this mindset. Many Sumerian terms related to social and religious institutions do not carry connotations of novelty or invention. They imply established functions. Even when texts refer to times long past, they do so in a way that emphasizes stability rather than transformation. The past is not a primitive stage. It is often portrayed as more ordered, closer to the gods, less burdened by limitation. This perspective makes the absence of a beginning feel intentional rather than accidental. If civilization is understood as the natural state of a properly ordered world, then describing its origin would be unnecessary. One does not explain the origin of gravity when describing architecture. One assumes it. Civilization, in the Sumerian view, seems to function in a similar way. It is a given condition, not a historical experiment. This does not mean the Sumerians lacked awareness of change. They recorded floods, invasions, dynastic collapses, and divine punishments. But these events are framed as disruptions of an established order, not steps toward creating it. The goal is always restoration, not progress towards something new. The gods themselves reinforce this structure. They are not innovators introducing new systems. They are administrators, judges, and guardians of order. When they intervene, it is usually to correct imbalance, redistribute authority, or impose limits. Creation, when it occurs, is purposeful and constrained. It solves a problem within an existing framework. Even humanity's creation fits this pattern. Humans are not created to explore or invent. They are created to work, to maintain canals, to grow food, to support temples. Their role is clearly defined from the beginning. There is no narrative of human trial and error leading to civilization. Civilization exists first, and humanity is fitted into it. This creates an inverted logic compared to modern historical thinking. Today, civilization is seen as the product of human ingenuity over time. In the Sumerian texts, humanity is shaped to serve civilization, which is already aligned with cosmic order. The system comes first. The participants come later. The completeness of the civilization also affects how memory is treated. The earliest texts do not frame themselves as preserving a vanishing past. They assume continuity into the future. Writing is a tool of administration and ritual, not nostalgia. The scribes do not express anxiety about losing knowledge. They assume that knowledge will be transmitted because the structures supporting it are stable. This confidence may explain why there is no urgency to record beginnings. Beginnings are only necessary to preserve when continuity is fragile. In a world perceived as ordered by divine authority and reinforced by ritual repetition, continuity feels guaranteed as long as proper behavior is maintained. As a result, the Sumerian record gives us a civilization that steps fully into view, already coherent, already layered, already complex. It does not invite us to watch it grow. It invites us to observe how it functions. This observation can be unsettling because it leaves modern readers without a familiar narrative anchor. There is no first village becoming a city, no moment when humans decide to live differently, no clear threshold separating before and after. Civilization appears as though it has always been there, extending backward into a time beyond description. As we move deeper into the texts, this pattern becomes even clearer. The silence around beginnings is not an oversight. It is a reflection of how the Sumerians understood their world. They lived inside a system that felt older than memory, sustained by forces larger than human choice, and governed by rules that did not need to be explained because they were already known. That sense of inherited completeness will continue to shape everything that follows. It influences how writing is used, how cities are remembered, how gods are portrayed, and how history itself is structured. The absence of a beginning is not a void waiting to be filled. It is a boundary, one that marks where explanation ends and assumption begins, quietly guiding the narrative forward without ever announcing itself. When the earlier Sumerian tablets are examined closely, one detail becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. They do not explain themselves. They do not introduce the systems they record, and they do not justify the structures they assume. The tablets speak from inside a world that already knows what it is doing. This is not simply a limitation of preservation or an accident of survival. The pattern is too consistent, too widespread, and too deeply embedded in every category of text to be dismissed as coincidence. Administrative tablets, which make up the bulk of the earliest written material, are particularly revealing in this respect. They list quantities of barley, beer, livestock, textiles, and labour assignments with a precision that suggests long practice. Symbols are used confidently. Numerical systems are standardised. Measures are understood without explanation. There is no indication that the scribes felt the need to explain how writing works or why these records matter. Writing is already normalised as a tool of governance and economy. This matters because administrative texts are usually the most pragmatic documents a society produces. They exist to solve immediate problems. If any category of writing were to reflect a learning phase, an experimental stage, or a period of adjustment, it would be these. But instead, they present a system that has already stabilised. There is no visible transition from informal marking to formal accounting. The tablets do not show writing being invented. They show writing being used. The same absence appears in religious texts. Hymns, prayers, and ritual instructions do not explain why certain gods are worshipped, or how temples came to be central institutions. They assume a shared understanding between scribe and reader. The gods already have names, domains, genealogies, and expectations. Ritual calendars are already in place. Offerings follow established patterns. The texts preserve performance, not origin. Even mythological compositions, which might be expected to reach back toward beginnings, rarely do so in a way that resembles a historical account. They describe cosmic conditions, divine relationships, and structural principles, but they do not trace a human story from simplicity to complexity. Creation narratives focus on arrangement rather than emergence. They describe how roles are assigned, how labour is distributed, and how balance is maintained. They do not describe humanity discovering agriculture, inventing tools, or gradually organising social life. This absence of origins creates a peculiar effect. The earliest written record feels as though it begins mid-sentence, not abruptly, but confidently, as if the most important parts of the story are already understood and no longer need to be repeated. The scribes write for an audience that shares their assumptions. The texts are not teaching civilization, they are operating within it. One might argue that earlier records simply did not survive. Clay tablets break, time erodes, floods bury archives. This explanation seems reasonable until one considers the sheer volume of early material that has been recovered and the consistency of what it contains. Thousands of tablets survive from the earliest periods of writing. They span multiple cities and regions. They cover different functions and genres. Yet none of them pause to explain how the systems they rely on came into existence. If the absence were accidental, one would expect at least occasional exceptions. A tablet reflecting on earlier practices, a myth hinting at a time before cities, an administrative note acknowledging a change in method. Instead, the silence is nearly absolute. This suggests that the omission is cultural rather than archival. The scribes who produced these tablets were not historians in the modern sense. Their goal was not to reconstruct the past for its own sake. Their responsibility was preservation of order. Writing was a stabilizing force. It fixed quantities, affirmed authority, reinforced ritual, and ensured continuity. In that context, origins were less important than correctness. This helps explain why beginnings are absent. Origins imply uncertainty. They suggest a time when things were not yet settled. Recording such a time might undermine the perceived stability of the present order. By contrast, presenting systems as ancient, inherited, and divinely sanctioned reinforces legitimacy. The older something appears, the more authoritative it becomes. This logic is visible in the way kingship is treated. Royal inscriptions do not describe the invention of rule. They describe its transfer. A king inherits authority from his predecessor, who inherited it from another, tracing back through a chain that eventually reaches divine origin. The first king is not portrayed as a human innovator. He is chosen, installed, and sanctioned. Authority flows downward. It does not arise organically. The same applies to law. Legal texts do not present laws as agreements or experiments. They present them as expressions of justice embedded in cosmic order. Even when laws change, they are framed as restorations or clarifications, not innovations. The idea that society could function without law, or that law emerged through negotiation, is absent. The earliest tablets also reveal a strong emphasis on correct repetition. Ritual texts are copied with care. Variations are minimized. The act of copying itself is sacred. This reinforces a worldview in which knowledge is something to be preserved accurately rather than developed creatively. In such a system, beginnings lose significance. What matters is continuity. Language reinforces this mindset. Many Sumerian terms related to institutions do not distinguish between origin and function. A temple is defined by what it does, not by when it was built. A city is defined by its role, not by its founding moment. Time is often measured by reigns and cycles rather than by absolute dates. This makes it difficult to situate beginnings within the conceptual framework of the culture. The tablets also reflect an assumption that order precedes human memory. In cosmological texts, the world is already structured before humans appear. Heaven and earth are separated. Waters are divided, roles are assigned. Humanity is introduced into a system that is already functioning. Humans do not shape the world from nothing, they are inserted into it. This worldview reduces the importance of human beginnings. If civilization is part of a larger cosmic arrangement, then tracing its human origin becomes secondary. Civilization exists because the world is ordered in a way that supports it. Explaining how humans discovered civilization would miss the point. The flood narratives further reinforce this pattern. The flood is not described as the beginning of civilization. It is a boundary. It resets populations, limits lifespans, and alters conditions, but it does not erase structure. After the flood, cities return, kingship returns, ritual returns, writing continues, the world resumes its proper form. This suggests that, in the Sumerian imagination, civilization is resilient. It can be interrupted but not erased. It belongs to the world itself, not to any particular generation. That makes beginnings less meaningful than continuities. Archaeological layers support this interpretation in subtle ways. At many sites, rebuilding occurs on the same footprints. Temples are reconstructed repeatedly in the same location. Cities are abandoned and reoccupied. This physical continuity mirrors the textual emphasis on preservation rather than origin. The past is not discarded. It is layered. The earliest tablets also lack self-consciousness about being early. Scribes do not identify themselves as pioneers. They do not express awareness that they are recording something new. Writing is treated as normal. This suggests that by the time writing appears in the archaeological record, it may already have undergone development elsewhere or earlier in ways that were not preserved. However, even if writing itself had earlier stages now lost, the broader absence of origin narratives remains. The texts do not show interest in origins even when writing becomes widespread. This points again to cultural priorities rather than material loss. The absence of origins also affects how memory functions. Instead of preserving a chronological narrative, the tablets preserve structure. They record who owes what, who rules where, which god governs which domain. Memory is institutional rather than personal. It serves administration, ritual, and legitimacy. This institutional memory does not require a starting point. It requires stability. As long as the system functions, its origin is irrelevant. In fact, questioning origins might destabilize authority by inviting comparison or doubt. This may explain why later cultures, influenced by Sumerian models, inherited similar patterns. Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian texts often build upon Sumerian frameworks without revisiting beginnings. They expand, reinterpret, and adapt, but they rarely question the foundational assumptions. The strange absence of origins in the earliest tablets is therefore not a mystery to be solved by discovering a missing text. It is a feature of how the Sumerians understood their world. Civilization was not something to be explained, it was something to be maintained. This perspective challenges modern expectations. We look for beginnings because we associate them with explanation. We assume that understanding how something started explains what it is. The Sumerians approached the world differently. For them, understanding how something functions explained what it is. As a result, the tablets speak in a voice that is confident, settled, and uninterested in justification. They describe a civilization that does not feel young even when it is. They assume knowledge rather than building it. They preserve order rather than narrating its emergence. This silence does not leave us without meaning. Instead, it redirects attention. It encourages us to read the text not as incomplete histories, but as expressions of a worldview in which the most important truths are not beginnings, but continuities. Civilization appears not because someone invented it, but because the world itself is structured in a way that allows it to exist. As the record continues, this absence will continue to shape how everything else is presented. The lack of origins does not fade. It deepens. It becomes part of the texture of the texts, guiding interpretation without ever stating its purpose. The tablets move forward, always already inside civilization, carrying their silence with them as a quiet constant that never needs to be explained. The moment writing appears in the Sumerian record, it does not behave like a new invention. It does not announce itself, explain its purpose, or reflect on its novelty. It functions as though it has always been there, as though both writer and reader already understand what writing is for and how it should be used. This alone tells us something crucial about how the Sumerians understood knowledge, memory, and civilization itself. The earliest tablets are not narratives. They are lists, tallies, inventories, and brief administrative notes. They record grain deliveries, labour obligations, temple offerings, livestock counts, and property transfers. This is not the kind of material a culture produces when it is experimenting with a new medium. These texts assume that writing is reliable, authoritative, and binding. A mark pressed into clay carries weight. It fixes reality in a way that spoken words alone do not. What is striking is not just that writing exists, but that it exists in service of memory rather than exploration. The tablets do not discover facts. They preserve them. They do not speculate. They confirm. Writing is not treated as a creative act, but as a stabilizing one. Its purpose is to ensure that what is already known remains known, that obligations are remembered correctly, that distributions are not forgotten, that order persists beyond the limits of individual recollection. This function shapes everything about how writing is used. The earlier scripts are not phonetic in the modern sense. They are logographic and numerical. Signs stand for commodities, actions, institutions, and quantities. This makes them efficient tools for record-keeping, but it also reveals something deeper. Writing emerges not as a way to tell stories, but as a way to anchor systems. In such a context, discovery is almost irrelevant. Discovery implies finding something new. But the Sumerian tablets are not interested in novelty. They assume that the world they are recording is already structured, already meaningful. Writing exists to ensure continuity, not to capture moments of insight. This assumption becomes even clearer when we consider how scribes were trained. Writing was taught through repetition. Students copied the same lists, the same signs, the same formulae again and again. Errors were corrected. Deviations were discouraged. The goal was accuracy, not expression. A scribe was valued for reliability, not originality. This training reinforces the idea that writing was a vessel for inherited knowledge. The scribe was not an author in the modern sense. He was a transmitter. His task was to preserve what had been handed down, not to add to it. This is why so many texts feel anonymous. Individual voice matters less than institutional continuity. When narrative texts do appear, such as hymns and myths, they still assume familiarity. They do not introduce characters slowly or establish background carefully. Gods appear fully formed. Places are named without explanation. Events unfold within a framework the audience is expected to recognize. Writing is not discovering the world for the reader. It is reminding the reader of a world they already inhabit. This is a fundamentally different relationship to writing than the one modern cultures often assume. Today, writing is associated with explanation, argument, and innovation. It is used to persuade, to explore ideas, to challenge assumptions. In the Sumerian context, writing is conservative in the deeper sense of the word. It conserves. This conservational role explains why writing does not record the origins of civilization. Writing itself is part of civilization's maintenance. It enters the picture only once systems are complex enough to require reinforcement. By the time writing is needed, civilization has already reached a level of organization that depends on memory, extending beyond human lifespans. The tablets therefore assume memory at a collective level. They are not teaching people how to live. They are reminding institutions how to function. They preserve agreements, schedules, hierarchies, and rituals. They are tools of administration and sacred duty. This also explains why writing is closely associated with temples and palaces. These are the centres of continuity. Temples preserve relationships between gods and humans. Palaces preserve authority across generations of rulers. Writing serves both by fixing obligations in durable form. The divine dimension of writing reinforces this role. Writing is often attributed to divine origin. It is described as a gift from the gods or as a sacred practice overseen by them. This does not mean the Sumerians believed gods physically invented writing in a technical sense. It means they understood writing as aligned with cosmic order. It participates in the same structure that governs justice, labour, and ritual. Because of this alignment, writing is not neutral. A written record carries authority because it reflects divine order. To alter it carelessly would be to disrupt balance. This further discourages experimentation. Writing must be correct, not creative. The absence of discovery is also visible in how writing handles change. When changes occur, they are recorded as updates, restorations, or corrections, not as breakthroughs. A new king does not invent a new system. He restores justice. A reform does not create something unprecedented. It returns things to their proper state. This language reveals a worldview in which the ideal order already exists, even if it is sometimes disrupted. Writing serves to realign reality with that ideal. It is corrective, not exploratory. Even when writing is used to record myths, those myths often function as explanations of structure rather than stories of discovery. They explain why roles exist, why gods have authority, why humans labour. They do not describe humans learning through trial and error. Knowledge is presented as revealed, assigned, or inherited. This approach to writing has important consequences for how time is perceived. If writing assumes memory rather than discovery, then the past is not a sequence of innovations leading to the present. It is a reservoir of correct forms. The task of the present is not to surpass the past, but to remain faithful to it. This fidelity to memory makes origins less relevant. What matters is not when something began, but whether it continues correctly. Writing is a tool for continuity, not a marker of progress. This also explains why Sumerian texts often feel timeless. They are not anchored to specific moments of invention. They float within a long durée of repetition. Even when dates are given, they're often tied to reigns or cycles rather than absolute timelines. Time is measured in terms of authority and ritual, not development. The writing itself mirrors this structure. Formulaic phrases recur across centuries. Administrative layouts remain consistent. Ritual language is preserved with remarkable stability. This continuity reinforces the impression that writing exists outside the flow of innovation. From a modern perspective, this can be disorienting. We expect writing to reveal growth. We look for early stages, gradual refinement, experimentation. The Sumerian record offers something else. It offers a snapshot of a system that already knows itself. This does not mean that discovery never occurred. It means that discovery was not the function of writing. Innovations likely happened in practice, through experience, adaptation, and necessity. But writing did not capture these moments. It captured the stabilized result. This separation between lived discovery and written memory is crucial. Writing enters after discovery has been absorbed into tradition. Once something works and becomes standard, it is recorded. The messy process that led there disappears from view. This may explain why writing feels so abrupt in the archaeological record. It appears fully functional because it only becomes visible once it is ready to serve institutional needs. Earlier experimental stages, if they existed, left little trace because they were not yet part of a system worth preserving. The result is a record that begins after the most transformative shifts have already taken place. Writing reflects a civilization that has moved past discovery and into maintenance. It is concerned with keeping things running, not figuring out how to start them. This orientation toward memory also shapes how knowledge is valued. Wisdom is associated with age, with what has been passed down. with what has endured. New ideas are suspect unless they can be framed as restorations of older truths. Writing reinforces this by anchoring authority in precedent. The scribes themselves embody this role. They are guardians of memory. Their status depends on their ability to recall, reproduce, and transmit established forms. Their power lies not in invention, but in preservation. In such a system, the true beginning of civilization would be almost impossible to record, even if it were remembered. By the time writing exists, the beginning is already irrelevant. Civilization is defined by its continuity, not its origin. This is why writing in the Sumerian world feels so confident. It does not need to justify itself. It does not need to explain why it exists. It assumes that its purpose is understood because it emerges from a shared understanding of order. As the record continues, this assumption remains constant. Writing continues to serve memory rather than discovery. It records what must be remembered so that civilization can continue functioning as it should. This perspective reshapes how the absence of origins should be understood. Writing does not omit beginnings because they were forgotten. It omits them because they were no longer relevant to the task writing was meant to perform. The tablets do not look backward to a moment of creation. They look outward, stabilizing a world already in motion. Writing does not announce the birth of civilization. It quietly ensures that civilization remembers itself. One of the quietest but most revealing silences in the Sumerian record appears when the subject turns to cities themselves. These cities dominate the texts. They are named repeatedly. They are praised, taxed, rebuilt, defended, and ruled. They are treated as living entities with identities, patron gods, and destinies. And yet, despite this constant attention, they almost never describe their own founding. The moment when a city begins, the act of its creation, the decision to settle in a particular place, remains almost entirely unspoken. This is striking because cities were everything to the Sumerians. Civilization, as they understood it, was inseparable from urban life. To live outside the city was to live closer to disorder. Cities were centres of worship, administration, economy, and memory. They were where writing was stored, where law was enforced, where gods were honoured. If any institution might be expected to preserve its own origin story, it would be the city. And yet the texts remain silent. When cities appear in the Sumerian record, they do not emerge gradually. They are already there. Uruk, Ur, Eridu, Lagash, Nippur, and many others enter the narrative as established places. Their walls stand, their temples function, their fields are irrigated, their populations are organised. The texts do not describe the clearing of land, the laying of foundations, or the first gathering of inhabitants. Instead, they treat cities as inherited realities. This pattern is consistent across genres. Administrative tablets record transactions tied to specific cities without explaining why those cities exist. Royal inscriptions boast of building projects, renovations and expansions, but not of founding. Even when a king claims credit for constructing a temple or strengthening a wall, he is almost always rebuilding something that already stood. The emphasis is on restoration and continuity, not on creation from nothing. Mythological texts follow the same logic. Cities are assigned to gods. Eridu belongs to Enki. Nippur is sacred to Enlil. Uruk is associated with Inanna. These assignments are presented as primordial facts. The city exists because the god dwells there, or the god dwells there because the city exists. The relationship is reciprocal and ancient, not historical in the modern sense. There is no story of a group of humans choosing a site and then attracting divine favour afterward. Divine presence and urban existence appear together, inseparable. Even the Sumerian king list, which might seem like a natural place to record city foundations, does not do so. It tells us that kingship moved from city to city, that authority shifted geographically over time, but it does not explain how those cities came into being. A city becomes important because kingship is there, not because it was founded. When kingship moves, the city's status changes, but the city itself remains. This reinforces the idea that cities were not understood as human projects in the way we might imagine today. They were not experiments in settlement or organization. They were manifestations of order. A city existed because the world was ordered in such a way that cities could exist. Humans did not create cities to escape chaos. Cities existed as part of the structure that kept chaos at bay. Archaeology complicates this picture without contradicting it. Excavations show that cities did develop over time, growing from smaller settlements into complex urban centres. But the textual silence remains. The people who lived in these cities and wrote about them did not feel compelled to record that development. By the time writing was in use, the cities were already old enough to feel timeless. This sense of timelessness is reinforced by how cities are described linguistically. City names are treated almost as proper nouns without qualifiers. They do not require explanation. A text does not say the city of Ur, which was founded long ago by our ancestors. It simply says Ur, assuming recognition. This suggests that cities were embedded deeply enough in cultural memory that their origins were no longer meaningful. The absence of founding narratives also reflects how legitimacy was constructed. In many later cultures, founding a city is an act of authority. The founder becomes a hero or ancestor. In Sumerian texts, authority flows differently. Legitimacy comes from divine favour and continuity, not from being first. A city is legitimate because a god recognises it, because rituals are performed correctly there, because kings rule there by divine sanction. This explains why rebuilding is more important than founding. A king who restores a temple or repairs a wall is praised because he maintains order. He aligns the present with the proper form of the past. Founding something new would imply deviation. Restoration implies correctness. This emphasis shapes how disasters are treated as well. When cities are destroyed by floods, wars, or divine punishment, the narrative focus is not on their creation afterward, but on their return. The city is rebuilt because it belongs there. Its destruction is an interruption, not an ending. The idea that a city could simply cease to exist permanently does not fit comfortably within the worldview the text present. Even when a city is abandoned for long periods, later texts often treat it as dormant rather than dead. Its name persists. Its sacred status remains. It can be reoccupied, resanctified, and reconnected to divine order. The city's identity outlives its population. This persistence suggests that cities were understood as more than physical settlements. They were conceptual anchors in the landscape. They connected heaven and earth. Temples acted as points of contact between divine and human realms. As long as that conceptual role existed, the city existed, regardless of its material condition. Because of this, describing a founding moment would be almost beside the point. The city's true existence was not tied to the moment humans built the first structure. It was tied to its place within cosmic order. That place was assumed to be ancient, perhaps eternal. This perspective also explains why the Sumerians could speak of cities existing before the flood. In mythological time, cities are already there. They are destroyed, then restored. Their continuity transcends individual historical epochs. This allows the texts to treat cities as enduring elements of the world rather than as temporary human creations. The absence of founding narratives also affects how space is perceived. Land is not empty, waiting to be settled. It is already meaningful. Rivers have names, plains have roles. Sacred sites exist before human construction. When a city stands somewhere, it stands there because that place already mattered. This stands in contrast to later colonial narratives where empty land is claimed and cities are planted as acts of expansion. The Sumerian worldview leaves little room for emptiness. The world is already structured. Cities occupy positions within that structure rather than imposing it. This may be why boundaries and borders matter so much in the texts. Cities are defined by their walls, fields, and canals. These features are maintained carefully. They mark the city's role within the larger system. But again, they are maintained, not established for the first time. The same pattern appears in how cities relate to one another. Rivalries, alliances, wars, and treaties are recorded, but rarely does a city's identity hinge on its founding story. Instead, identity is shaped by relationships, by divine patronage, and by historical continuity. This silence around founding also affects how we interpret the absence of the true beginning of civilization. If cities are already complete when the texts begin, and if cities are the core of civilization, then civilization itself must predate the record. The texts are not hiding a beginning. They are written from a point where the beginning is already far enough in the past to no longer matter. This does not mean the Sumerians believed cities had always existed in a literal sense. It means that, within their conceptual framework, the meaningful existence of a city did not start with construction. It started with order. Once order was established, the city existed in the only sense that mattered. This helps explain why, even when a king claims to have founded a city in later Mesopotamian texts, that claim is often symbolic rather than literal. Founding can mean reorganizing, renaming, or resanctifying. It does not necessarily mean creating something where nothing existed before. It means aligning a place with proper authority. The Sumerian record, taken as a whole, suggests that cities were perceived as part of the natural condition of a civilized world. They were not optional. They were not experimental. They were necessary expressions of order. Humanity belonged in cities because civilization belonged in cities. This perspective removes the need for founding stories. One does not narrate the beginning of what feels inevitable. One narrates its maintenance, its crises, and its restorations. The texts follow that logic faithfully. As a result, when we search the Sumerian tablets for the moment civilization truly began, we encounter cities that refuse to tell us how they started. They stand before us already complete, already confident, already embedded in a world that expects them to be there. This silence is not a failure of memory. It is a reflection of how the Sumerians understood their place in time. They did not live at the beginning. They lived within an ongoing order. Their cities were not monuments to human ingenuity alone. They were nodes in a structure that felt older than any single generation. As the narrative continues, this pattern will persist. Cities will act, suffer, and endure, but they will rarely explain themselves. Their existence will be assumed. Their origins will remain unspoken. And in that silence, we glimpse a civilization that did not define itself by how it began, but by how well it remembered what it was meant to be. In the Sumerian record, kingship does not appear as a human solution to human problems. It does not grow out of conflict resolution, tribal leadership, or gradual social negotiation. It does not emerge from within society at all. Instead, it arrives. Kingship descends. This single idea, stated plainly and repeatedly in the texts, reshapes how authority, history, and civilization itself are understood. The most famous expression of this concept appears at the very beginning of the Sumerian king list. The text does not ease into its subject or provide background. It opens with a declaration of cosmic fact. Kingship descended from heaven. Only after this statement does the narrative move on to name the first city where kingship was exercised. The order is crucial. Kingship exists before any human ruler. Authority is already formed before it touches the earth. This framing removes kingship from the realm of human invention entirely. No council debates its necessity. No group selects a leader. No individual rises through strength or persuasion. Authority arrives as a complete system. Humans do not create it. They receive it. This pattern repeats across genres. Royal inscriptions do not claim that a king earned his position through personal achievement alone. They emphasize selection, appointment, or favor. A king is chosen by the gods. He is called to rule. His legitimacy rests on alignment with divine order rather than popular consent or military success, even when force is clearly involved. This does not mean Sumerian kings lacked ambition or power. They waged wars, expanded territories, and enforced laws. But the texts consistently present these actions as exercises of authority already granted, not as steps toward obtaining it. A king acts because he is king. He does not become king because he acts. The idea that kingship descends also explains why the earliest rulers are portrayed so differently from later ones. In the king list, the first kings rule for spans of time that far exceed human lifespans. These reigns stretch tens of thousands of years. Modern readers often treat these numbers as symbolic or exaggerated, but within the Sumerian worldview they serve a clear function. They mark a different condition of existence. These early rulers are not merely powerful humans. They occupy a space closer to the divine. Their longevity reflects proximity to the source of kingship itself. Authority has only just arrived on Earth, and it has not yet been fully limited by human constraints. Over time, reigns grow shorter. Lifespans contract. Kings become more recognizably human. This gradual change does not represent progress. It represents distance. The further kingship moves from its point of descent, the more constrained it becomes. Mortality increases. Authority fragments. Conflict becomes more frequent. This is not framed as decline caused by poor leadership alone. It is a natural consequence of kingship existing in a human world. This perspective changes how political history is written. Instead of tracing the evolution of governance, the texts trace the transmission of authority. Kingship moves from city to city. It does not originate in each place independently. When one city loses kingship, it is not because governance failed there. It is because kingship has departed. This movement reinforces the idea that kingship is portable, but not divisible. It exists as a singular principle that can reside in one place at a time. A city becomes central not because it is powerful, but because kingship is there. When kingship leaves, the city's status diminishes. This model eliminates the need for explanations about how political systems developed. There is no evolutionary narrative. There is only alignment or misalignment with an existing principle. A king rules correctly if he maintains order as defined by divine expectation. He rules incorrectly if he disrupts that order. Law follows the same logic. Laws are not invented through debate. They are revealed, declared, or restored. Even when a king issues a new law code, it is framed as an act of justice, not innovation. The king does not create justice, he enacts it. This understanding also shapes how rebellion is portrayed. Rebellion is not the birth of a new political order. It is a disruption. It is framed as disorder, noise, or imbalance. Even successful rebellions are eventually absorbed into the existing framework of kingship rather than redefining it. The divine role in kingship further reinforces this structure. Gods are not merely patrons of kings. They are the source of kingship itself. A king is often described as shepherd of the people, a metaphor that emphasizes responsibility rather than dominance. The shepherd does not own the flock. He tends it on behalf of a higher authority. This metaphor appears repeatedly in Sumerian and later Mesopotamian texts. It implies care, guidance, and accountability. A shepherd who fails in his duty is punished. A king who rules unjustly faces divine consequences. Authority is conditional, not absolute. This conditional authority does not come from human institutions. It comes from the gods. This makes kingship simultaneously powerful and precarious. A king cannot appeal to popular support if he loses divine favour. He cannot legitimize himself through tradition alone if the gods withdraw support. This dynamic explains why kings invest so heavily in temple building, ritual performance, and offerings. These acts are not merely displays of piety. They are demonstrations of alignment. They show that the king understands his role within the cosmic order. The emphasis on descent also explains why the Sumerian record shows little interest in the personal backgrounds of kings. Their childhoods, families, and formative experiences are rarely detailed. What matters is not who they were before ruling, but whether they are properly installed. Even succession follows this pattern. A son inherits kingship not simply through bloodline, but through confirmation. Divine approval must be renewed. This is why omens, rituals, and signs play such a prominent role in transitions of power. Kingship does not automatically pass. It must be re-established. This makes kingship feel less like a human institution and more like a force that passes through human hands. Individuals are temporary vessels. The principle remains. The flood narratives reinforce this view. When the flood destroys the world, kingship does not vanish permanently. After the waters recede, kingship descends again. The same principle reasserts itself. Humanity resumes its place under authority. Civilization continues. This continuity suggests that kingship belongs to the structure of the world rather than to historical circumstances. It is as fundamental as the separation of heaven and earth. It does not need to be invented because it already exists. This worldview leaves little room for a true beginning of political authority. There is no moment when humans decide to govern themselves. Governance arrives as part of cosmic order. Humans participate in it, but they do not originate it. This also affects how failure is understood. When a city falls or a dynasty collapses, the cause is often framed in moral or ritual terms. The king failed to uphold order. The gods withdrew support. Kingship moved elsewhere. The system itself remains intact. This is why even foreign conquerors often adopt local titles and rituals. To rule effectively, they must align themselves with existing kingship rather than replacing it. Authority must descend upon them as well, or their rule will lack legitimacy. Over time, this concept influences later Mesopotamian cultures. Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian kings inherit the same language. They describe themselves as chosen, called, established by the gods. Even when empires expand dramatically, the fundamental logic of kingship remains unchanged. This persistence suggests that the idea of descending kingship was deeply embedded in the Mesopotamian understanding of civilization. It was not a rhetorical device, it was a foundational assumption. This assumption also helps explain why the Sumerian texts never describe the emergence of political authority as part of human development. There is nothing to describe. Authority does not develop. It arrives. The silence around political beginnings mirrors the silence around urban and cultural beginnings. Civilization appears already complete because its core structures are believed to originate beyond human action. Writing records their operation, not their invention. This does not mean that real historical processes did not occur. Leadership structures did evolve. Power was contested. Institutions changed. But the texts are not interested in those processes as origins. They are interested in outcomes that align with cosmic order. As a result, the narrative of kingship moves forward without ever looking back to a first ruler in a human sense. The first kings are already extraordinary. They rule impossibly long lives. They exist at the edge of myth and history. The closer the record moves toward historical time, the more human kings become. But even then, the language of descent persists. Authority is still something given, not made. This continuity shapes the entire record. It reinforces the idea that civilization does not begin when humans organize themselves. It begins when order touches the world. Kingship is one of the clearest expressions of that belief. As the story continues, this descending authority will intersect with knowledge, law, labor, and divine judgment. Kings will act, succeed, fail, and be replaced, but the principle that legitimizes them will remain untouched. Kingship does not need an origin story because it is not understood as human achievement. It is a condition of the world, arriving from above, settling briefly in human hands, and moving on when alignment is lost. This perspective leaves the true beginning of civilization permanently out of reach. Civilization does not start when a king rises. It starts when order exists. Kingship merely reveals that order by descending into a world already prepared to receive it. Throughout the Sumerian record, knowledge is never portrayed as something humanity slowly acquires through experimentation, failure, and gradual improvement. It does not emerge from curiosity or problem-solving in the way modern narratives often assume. Instead, knowledge appears as something already present, already structured, already possessed, and then passed down. It is inherited rather than learned, received rather than discovered, maintained rather than developed. This distinction shapes nearly every aspect of how information appears in the texts. Technical skills, religious practices, administrative procedures, and even moral understanding are not introduced as innovations. They're treated as established forms that must be preserved correctly. The role of the human participant is not to figure them out, but to remember them accurately and apply them properly. One of the clearest examples of this appears in how crafts and technologies are described. Agriculture, irrigation, metalworking, weaving, construction, and writing itself are not portrayed as human achievements born from trial and error. They are gifts, assignments, or responsibilities associated with specific gods. A craft exists because a god oversees it. Humans practice it because they have been taught or instructed to do so, not because they invented it independently. This framing removes the idea of learning through discovery almost entirely. There is no narrative of early farmers experimenting with seeds, discovering which crops grow best, refining techniques over generations. Instead, grain cultivation is presented as part of an ordered system. It functions correctly when divine expectations are met and fails when balance is disrupted. Success and failure are moral and ritual conditions, not experimental outcomes. The same logic applies to writing. Writing does not emerge as a human attempt to solve communication problems. It is associated with divine wisdom, with order, with record-keeping that aligns with cosmic structure. Scribes do not describe how writing was developed. They treat it as something that exists because it should exist. Their responsibility is to use it properly. This approach to knowledge influences how education functions. Sumerian scribal training is based almost entirely on repetition. Students memorize lists of signs, words, professions, animals, places, and ritual phrases. These lists are not exploratory. They're exhaustive. They present the world as something already categorized and named. Learning is not about questioning these categories. It is about internalizing them. The lists themselves reveal how knowledge was conceptualized. They do not evolve noticeably over time. Many remain stable across centuries. This stability suggests that knowledge was seen as complete in principle, even if its application varied. The task was not to expand understanding, but to preserve it against decay. This preservation is tied closely to authority. Knowledge gains legitimacy from age. The older a practice or text is perceived to be, the more authoritative it becomes. New ideas struggle to gain acceptance unless they can be framed as restorations of older truths. Innovation, when it occurs, must disguise itself as recovery. This dynamic explains why so many reforms in Mesopotamian history are described as returns to justice rather than new policies. A king does not claim to invent better laws. He claims to restore fairness that existed before. Knowledge is always backward-facing in its justification, even when it produces forward movement in practice. Religious knowledge follows the same pattern. Rituals are not developed creatively. They are performed correctly or incorrectly. Their power lies in their exactness. A ritual works because it has always worked, because it aligns with divine order established long ago. Alteration introduces risk. Precision ensures continuity. Even myths reinforce this logic. When gods create humans, they do not teach them gradually. They assign roles immediately. Humans know what they are for from the beginning. There is no mythic childhood of humanity marked by ignorance. There is no narrative of learning to be human. Humanity enters the world with a function already defined. This framing extends to moral knowledge as well. Concepts like justice, order, and duty are not discovered through experience. They are embedded in the structure of the world. Kings are expected to uphold justice not because they have reasoned their way to ethical conclusions, but because justice exists independently of them. They are judged by how well they align with it. The gods themselves model this inherited knowledge. Even divine beings operate within established frameworks. They have roles, domains, and responsibilities assigned through genealogy and cosmic order. While they can argue, compete, and deceive, they rarely invent new principles. They enforce or redistribute existing ones. This has important implications for how time is understood. If knowledge is inherited rather than learned, then the past is not primitive, it is authoritative. Earlier generations are not less informed, they are closer to the source. Knowledge degrades over time unless actively preserved. This perspective contrasts sharply with modern assumptions about progress. Today, knowledge is often seen as cumulative, expanding through discovery. In the Sumerian worldview, knowledge is fragile. It must be guarded against loss. Writing exists partly to prevent forgetting, not to enable innovation. This concern with forgetting appears repeatedly in the texts. Disasters are dangerous not only because they destroy lives and cities, but because they threaten memory. Floods wash away tablets. Wars disrupt ritual continuity. When order collapses, knowledge is at risk. Restoration is therefore an act of remembrance as much as reconstruction. The flood narratives highlight this anxiety. When the world is nearly destroyed, what matters is not rebuilding from scratch, but preserving the seed of what already exists. Humans survive not to invent civilization again, but to continue it. Animals survive not to evolve, but to repopulate. Knowledge survives through divine intervention and careful preservation. This reinforces the idea that civilization itself is a form of knowledge that must be inherited intact. Its beginning is not important. Its continuation is everything. The way wisdom figures are portrayed further supports this. Figures associated with wisdom are not innovators, they are mediators. They know how to interpret signs, read omens, apply rituals, and navigate divine expectations. Their skill lies in understanding what already exists, not in discovering something new. Even when cleverness is celebrated, it is usually about navigating constraints rather than breaking them. Enki's intelligence, for example, lies in his ability to work within the rules of divine law while bending outcomes. He does not invent a new order. He preserves humanity by exploiting loopholes in an existing one. This kind of intelligence values memory, precedent, and understanding of structure. It is not experimental intelligence, it is interpretive. This emphasis affects how mistakes are understood. Errors are not framed as learning opportunities. They are deviations from correct form. A mistake does not advance knowledge. It threatens order. Correction involves returning to proper practice, not refining through iteration. This approach also explains why the Sumerian record does not show a gradual improvement of techniques over time in the way archaeological evidence might suggest. Improvements certainly occurred in practice, but the texts frame them as refinements of existing systems, not as breakthroughs. For example, irrigation systems become more complex over time, but the texts do not celebrate this complexity as innovation. They treat irrigation as a given requirement of civilization. Its expansion is administrative, not conceptual. The same is true of law. Legal complexity increases, but the underlying principles remain constant. Justice is not redefined. It is applied to new situations. The framework does not change. Its reach expands. This inherited view of knowledge also shapes how outsiders are portrayed. Non-Sumerian peoples are often depicted as lacking proper order, not because they are less intelligent, but because they do not participate in the same inherited systems. They are not ignorant, they are misaligned. This distinction reinforces cultural boundaries. To be civilized is to possess inherited knowledge and to apply it correctly. Civilization is not something one learns by trial. It is something one enters through alignment with established forms. This has implications for how the true beginning of civilization disappears from the record. If civilization is defined by inherited knowledge, then its origin lies beyond memory. By the time knowledge can be inherited, it must already exist. Writing appears when inheritance becomes complex enough to require reinforcement. The origin of civilization, then, is not a human event that can be recorded. It is a condition that must already be in place for recording to make sense. Writing does not capture the birth of knowledge, it captures its transmission. This also explains why the Sumerian record is so focused on lists. Lists are tools of inheritance. They define what exists, what matters, and what must be remembered. They stabilize reality by naming it. A list does not argue. It does not persuade. It asserts. It tells the reader that this is how the world is organized. To learn is to memorize the list. To forget is to risk disorder. This worldview creates a civilization deeply concerned with continuity. Knowledge must flow unbroken from generation to generation. Breaks in transmission are dangerous. The past must remain accessible. In such a system, beginnings fade quickly. Once knowledge is inherited, its origin becomes irrelevant. What matters is that it continues to be inherited correctly. This is why the Sumerian text feels so confident, even when describing ancient times. They do not doubt their own authority. They do not search for validation. They assume correctness because they align with inherited order. As the narrative moves forward, this inherited knowledge will continue to shape how humanity is portrayed, how gods interact with the world, and how history is structured. Learning will rarely appear as discovery. Wisdom will rarely appear as novelty. This silence around beginnings is therefore not ignorance. It is the natural result of a civilization that understood knowledge as something received, preserved, and transmitted across time. Civilization does not begin when humans learn something new. It begins when they are entrusted with something old. And once that trust is established, the act of learning disappears into the background. What remains is inheritance, repetition, and the quiet responsibility of remembering what was never meant to be reinvented. In the Sumerian imagination, the gods are not explorers standing at the edge of nothingness, deciding what to create for the first time. They are not depicted as inventors experimenting with possibilities or discovering solutions through uncertainty. Instead, they appear as organizers. Their defining role is not to bring something new into existence, but to impose structure on what already exists. They establish order. They assign roles. They define boundaries. The idea of a true beginning, a moment where nothing existed before, remains distant and indistinct. This distinction is subtle but decisive. When Sumerian texts describe the actions of gods, those actions are almost always corrective, distributive, or administrative. The gods separate, arrange, measure, and assign. Heaven and earth are divided, waters are apportioned, domains are defined, responsibilities are distributed. Even creation itself, when described, is framed as a response to imbalance rather than as a spontaneous act of invention. The primordial condition described in Sumerian cosmology is not emptiness. It is undifferentiated fullness. Water exists. Potential exists. Substance exists. What is missing is distinction. The gods do not create substance from nothing. They create difference. They transform a state where everything is blended into a state where things have names, places, and functions. This framing immediately shifts attention away from beginnings in the modern sense. There is no absolute starting point. There is only a transition from indistinction to order. The gods do not mark a first moment. They enforce a structure. This is why the earliest divine figures are often abstract rather than personal. They represent conditions rather than personalities. They are waters, skies, earths, winds. They are not yet characters with stories. Their importance lies in what they enable, not in what they originate. As the divine hierarchy develops, the gods become more recognizable as agents, but their role remains consistent. They govern, they regulate, they intervene when balance is threatened. They do not celebrate novelty, they restore alignment. When humans appear in these narratives, it is not because the gods decided to begin something new. It is because the existing order requires maintenance. The gods grow weary of labour. The system strains under its own demands. Humanity is introduced as a solution, not as a creative experiment. This is a crucial point. Humans are not created because the gods want companions, or because the world is incomplete. Humans are created because the ordered world already exists and needs to be sustained. Creation is functional, not expressive. The gods themselves operate within constraints. They argue, they negotiate, they follow procedures. Decisions are made collectively. Decrees are binding once spoken. This suggests that even divine authority is subject to structure. The gods do not act arbitrarily. They act according to established norms. This internal order among the gods mirrors the order they impose on the world. Just as cities have hierarchies and kings have obligations, the divine realm has its own governance. Councils meet, votes are taken, responsibilities are divided. Because of this, the gods rarely question the structure of existence itself. They assume it. Their concerns focus on administration. Who is responsible for which domain? Who has overstepped? Who has failed in their duties? This perspective leaves little space for a story about beginnings. Beginnings imply uncertainty and choice. The Sumerian gods are not portrayed as uncertain. They are portrayed as custodians of a system that already has expectations. Even conflict among the gods does not produce new orders. It reshuffles authority within an existing framework. When one god rises, another falls. When one city gains favour, another loses it. But the structure remains intact. This is especially visible in flood narratives. The flood is not a new creation. It is a reset. It returns the world temporarily to a watery state, but that state is not celebrated as an origin. It is dangerous, destructive, and excessive. Order must be restored afterward. After the flood, the gods do not invent a new civilization. They re-establish limits. They impose mortality. They regulate population. They adjust conditions so that order can persist without becoming overwhelming. Civilization resumes its course, altered but continuous. This reinforces the idea that order precedes humanity and outlasts catastrophe. The gods are responsible for maintaining that order, not for inventing it repeatedly. The same logic applies to divine gifts. When gods grant humans tools, knowledge, or institutions, these are not presented as discoveries humans could have made themselves given enough time. They are presented as allocations. The gods decide when and how humans receive them. The gifts already belong to the structure of the world. Humans are permitted to use them. This is why divine generosity is often paired with divine restriction. Knowledge is given, but with boundaries. Power is granted, but with limits. When humans overstep, the gods intervene not because humans have invented something dangerous, but because they have disrupted balance. This perspective also affects how the gods relate to time. They are not bound to linear progression in the same way humans are. Past, present, and future are less distinct. Decrees made long ago still apply. Decisions echo across generations. Because of this, the gods do not need to mark a beginning. Their authority does not depend on a founding event. It depends on continuity of enforcement. This continuity is reinforced through ritual. Rituals do not commemorate beginnings. They reenact order. They repeat actions that align the present with the proper form of the past. Through ritual, the gods' ordering work is renewed continually. The emphasis on repetition rather than initiation shapes the entire religious system. Festivals follow cycles, offerings recur, hymns repeat phrases and structures, variation is minimal, stability is the goal. This ritual repetition mirrors the gods' role. They do not innovate, they stabilize. Their power lies in making sure that things continue to function as they should. This also explains why the gods are rarely depicted as curious. Curiosity implies a desire to know what is unknown. The gods already know what matters. Their concern is not discovery, but compliance. Even wisdom deities operate within this framework. Wisdom is not about uncovering new truths. It is about understanding existing structures deeply enough to navigate them effectively. Cleverness lies in interpretation, not invention. This is why divine wisdom often appears as foresight rather than insight. The wise god anticipates consequences. He understands how actions ripple through the system. He does not create new principles. He manipulates existing ones. The god's relationship to humanity further reinforces this orientation. Humans are evaluated based on their alignment with order. Obedience, ritual correctness, and respect for boundaries matter more than creativity. Success is measured by harmony, not innovation. This does not mean that human creativity was absent in practice. Cities expanded, technologies improved, art flourished. But these developments are rarely attributed to human ingenuity alone. They are framed as expressions of divine favour or correct alignment. By attributing order to the gods, the Sumerian worldview removes the burden of explaining how civilization began. Civilization exists because order exists. Order exists because the gods maintain it. Asking how civilization began becomes less relevant than asking how order is preserved. This perspective also provides a way to cope with instability. When disasters strike, they are not signs that civilization was flawed from the start. They are signs that order was disturbed. Restoration becomes possible because order itself remains intact at a deeper level. The gods are therefore guarantors of continuity. They ensure that even when human systems fail, the underlying structure can be reasserted. This continuity stretches backward as well as forward. The gods are linked to a time before human memory, but that time is not narrated in detail. It is acknowledged as prior, but not described as a beginning. It is a condition, not an event. The silence around divine beginnings parallels the silence around human beginnings. Just as cities do not describe their founding, gods do not describe their own origin in a way that resembles a starting point. Genealogies exist, but they extend into abstraction rather than history. This abstraction protects the authority of the gods. If their origin were described as a specific event, it might be questioned. By remaining distant and structural, their authority remains unquestionable. The Sumerian gods are therefore best understood not as creators in the modern sense, but as custodians of order. They shape, regulate, and preserve. They do not explore possibilities. They enforce boundaries. This enforcement is sometimes harsh. Floods, plagues, and punishments reflect the gods' commitment to balance, not to compassion alone. Order takes precedence over individual well-being. This priority shapes the moral universe of the texts. Good and evil are less important than proper and improper. Actions are judged by their effect on order rather than by intention. Within this framework, beginnings fade into irrelevance. What matters is whether the world functions correctly now. This is why the Sumerian record feels so firmly anchored. It does not drift into speculation about origins. It does not imagine alternative paths. It records a world governed by rules that are assumed to be older than memory. The gods stand at the centre of this world not as inventors, but as administrators. They distribute authority, knowledge, and responsibility. They correct deviations. They ensure continuity. As the narrative continues, this role will become even more apparent. The gods will intervene not to create something unprecedented, but to restore balance, reassign power, or impose limits. The absence of beginnings is not a gap waiting to be filled. It is a consequence of a worldview that understands existence as structured from the outset, maintained through constant attention, rather than initiated through singular events. Civilization, in this view, does not begin because someone decides to start it. It exists because order exists. The gods do not inaugurate history, they regulate it. And so the record moves forward, guided by divine administration rather than creative impulse, carrying with it a vision of the world where beginnings dissolve into structure, and structure endures without needing to explain how it first came to be. By the time the Sumerian texts begin to speak in their own voice, the world they describe is not tentative, unstable, or in the process of becoming. It is already functioning. Systems are in place. Relationships between humans, gods, land, and labour are established. The texts do not pause to explain how these systems came together. They operate as though their existence is expected, even inevitable. This sense of a functioning world appears immediately in the most mundane documents. Administrative tablets record deliveries of grain to temples, assignments of labour crews to irrigation work, distributions of rations to workers, and tallies of livestock managed by officials whose titles are already standardised. None of this activity is framed as experimental. There is no indication that these practices are new or uncertain. The tablets do not justify why grain is collected centrally, or why labour is organised hierarchically. They assume that such arrangements are normal. This assumption extends beyond economics into social life. Families, households, professions and ranks appear fully formed. The texts recognise fathers, sons, wives, dependents, overseers, priests and kings, as if these categories require no explanation. Social roles are treated as part of the natural order of things. A person's position in society is something to be recorded and managed, not something to be debated or defined. The same applies to space. Fields are measured, canals are maintained, boundaries are marked, cities interact through trade and conflict. The landscape is not wild or undefined, it is organised and named. Rivers follow known courses, sacred sites are fixed. Even distant regions are described in relation to known centres, implying a shared geographic understanding. Religious life reinforces this impression. Temples function as economic hubs as much as sacred spaces. Offerings are scheduled, rituals follow calendars, priests perform duties that are clearly defined. The gods receive what they are owed. The relationship between divine and human spheres is already regulated. There is no sense in these texts that people are still learning how to live in a civilized way. Civilization is not fragile, it is routine. The danger lies not in ignorance, but in neglect. Order fails not because people do not know what to do, but because they fail to do it correctly. This framing becomes even clearer in mythological compositions. When gods act, they do so within a world that already has structure. Heaven and earth have been separated, waters have been apportioned, domains have been assigned. The gods are not creating a blank slate, they are managing an existing system. When humans appear in these narratives, they are inserted into a functioning environment. Fields exist, canals exist, temples exist. The problem the gods face is not how to build civilization, but how to sustain it without exhausting divine labour. Humanity is created as a workforce, not as a creative force. This is a critical distinction. Humans are not portrayed as discovering civilization, they are portrayed as maintaining it. Their purpose is defined by the needs of an already ordered world. This orientation affects how time is experienced. The texts do not mark a sharp division between before and after civilization. Instead, they move within a continuous present that extends backward into mythic time. Events occur, disasters strike, dynasties rise and fall, but the underlying structure remains recognizable. Even the flood, which might seem like a radical interruption, does not reset the world to a pre-civilized state. It destroys populations and cities, but not the idea of cities or the system of kingship. After the flood, order resumes. The same patterns reassert themselves. Civilization continues, adjusted but intact. This continuity suggests that, in the Sumerian worldview, civilization is not a phase humanity enters. It is the default condition of a properly ordered world. Disorder is temporary. Chaos is an aberration. Stability is expected. This expectation shapes how failure is understood. When crops fail, it is not because agriculture is still being figured out. It is because rituals were neglected or divine favour was withdrawn. When a city falls, it is not because urban life is unsustainable. It is because order was disrupted. The world functions correctly when alignment is maintained. This alignment involves correct ritual, just leadership, proper distribution of labour, and respect for divine authority. The texts are concerned with these conditions, not with how the system came into existence. This concern with functioning rather than forming also explains why innovation is rarely celebrated explicitly. Improvements occur, but they are absorbed quietly into existing frameworks. A new technique becomes part of tradition as soon as it works. The moment of discovery disappears. This disappearance is reinforced by how writing records outcomes rather than processes. A canal is recorded once it exists and requires maintenance. The trial and error phase that led to its construction is not preserved. The record begins once functionality is achieved. The same applies to law. Laws are recorded once they are enforceable. The debates or conflicts that led to their formulation are rarely documented. What matters is that the law now exists and must be followed. This selective recording creates a textual world that feels complete because it only shows completed systems. The messiness of development is filtered out. What remains is order. This does not mean the Sumerians were unaware of change. They lived through wars, famines, and political upheavals. But the texts frame these events as disruptions to a functioning world rather than as steps toward building one. This framing also affects how progress is understood. Progress is not linear improvement. It is successful maintenance. A good reign is one that preserves stability. A bad reign is one that allows disorder to spread. This perspective discourages speculation about origins. Origins belong to a time before functioning. They are, by definition, irrelevant to a world that already works. The texts focus on keeping the world working, not on explaining how it started. The gods reinforce this focus. They intervene when systems fail. They punish negligence. They reward proper behaviour. They do not encourage experimentation. They demand adherence. This demand shapes human behaviour. People learn what is expected of them not through exploration, but through instruction and repetition. Knowledge is passed down, roles are inherited, the world continues. This continuity gives the impression that civilization has always existed. While this is not literally true, it is experientially true for the people writing and reading the texts. Their lived reality does not include a memory of pre-civilized existence. That memory, if it ever existed, has receded beyond reach. As a result, the texts do not attempt to reconstruct it. They do not imagine a time when humans lived without cities, laws, or gods. Such a time would be meaningless within their framework. The world begins, for them, where order begins, and order is already present when the texts speak. This explains why the Sumerian record feels so confident. It does not search for foundations, it stands on them. It assumes that the structures supporting existence are firm, and that human responsibility lies in preserving them. This confidence is not naive. It is born from a worldview that sees stability as fragile but recoverable. When things break, they can be fixed because the model of how things should function remains intact. The absence of a described beginning is therefore not a gap in knowledge. It is a reflection of priorities. The texts care about how the world operates, not how it came into being. This operating world is deeply interconnected. Economy supports ritual. Ritual supports divine favour. Divine favour supports political authority. Political authority supports order. Order supports survival. Each element depends on the others. Describing a beginning would isolate one element and treat it as primary. The Sumerian worldview resists this. It sees the world as a system, not as a sequence. This systemic thinking is visible everywhere. Lists categorize reality, laws regulate interactions, myths explain relationships. None of these focus on origins, they focus on balance. This balance extends backward in time as well. The past is not a primitive stage, it is a source of authority. The closer something is to the past, the closer it is to the ideal form of order. This reverence for the past further diminishes interest in beginnings. The beginning is too distant, too abstract, and too undefined to serve as a useful reference. What matters is the remembered past, not the imagined origin. This remembered past is preserved through writing, ritual, and tradition. It provides a template for action. It tells people how to live now. In this sense, the Sumerian texts begin at the only point that matters. They begin where order is already functioning and requires attention. They do not begin where order is absent. This orientation makes the true beginning of civilization inaccessible by design. It lies beyond the scope of what writing was meant to capture. Writing exists to support a world that already works. It does not exist to explain how that world came into existence. As the narrative continues, this assumption will remain constant. The world will be challenged, strained, and sometimes broken, but it will always be understood as something that can and should function correctly. Civilization does not need a starting line in this worldview. It is not a race with a beginning and an end. It is a condition that persists as long as order is maintained. The texts speak from within that condition. They record its rhythms, its failures, and its repairs. They do not look behind it. And so the world they present feels complete, not because nothing came before it, but because everything that matters is already in motion. One of the most telling absences in the Sumerian record is not a city, a law, or a technology, but a people. There is no clear first generation of humans. Humanity does not appear gradually, uncertainly, or experimentally. It arrives already defined, already functional, already assigned a place within a system that predates it. The texts do not describe a time when humans were learning how to be human. When humanity enters the Sumerian narrative, it does so without childhood. There is no long prelude of wandering, no age of trial, no collective ignorance slowly giving way to understanding. Humans are created, and immediately they work. They cultivate fields, maintain canals, serve temples, and participate in ritual life. Their purpose is known from the moment they appear. This is not an oversight. It reflects a worldview in which humanity is not the starting point of civilization, but a component introduced after the framework already exists. Humans are not pioneers carving order out of chaos. They are caretakers placed into an ordered world. The creation accounts make this explicit. The gods are already labouring. The cosmos already functions. Irrigation canals exist. Fields need tending. Temples require maintenance. The problem is not how to build a world. The problem is who will keep it running. Humanity is created as an answer to that problem. This framing eliminates the need for a first generation in the modern sense. A first generation implies learning, adaptation, and discovery. The Sumerian humans do none of these things at the beginning. They are created to perform specific tasks, and they perform them. The narrative skips directly to functionality. This absence becomes even more striking when compared to later cultural traditions. In many mythologies, the first humans struggle. They make mistakes. They lack knowledge. They must be taught, punished, corrected. Their early existence is marked by uncertainty. In the Sumerian texts, this phase is almost entirely absent. Instead, humanity appears competent from the outset. Humans know how to farm. They understand labour obligations. They participate in ritual correctly. They recognise divine authority. There is no story of humans learning language, discovering fire, or inventing tools. These elements are either assumed or attributed to divine assignment. This suggests that the Sumerians did not conceptualize humanity as evolving culturally in the way modern frameworks often assume. Culture is not something humans slowly build. It is something humans enter. This perspective has profound implications for how memory functions. If humanity never existed in a pre-cultural state worth remembering, then there is nothing to record about that state. The absence of a first generation is not a loss. It is a reflection of how humanity was understood. The first humans are not ancestors in the genealogical sense. They are prototypes. They represent humanity's role rather than humanity's origin. Once that role is established, individual generations matter less than continuity of function. This is why genealogies, when they appear, often focus on kings rather than on humanity as a whole. Kingship matters because it channels authority. Humanity matters collectively because it sustains civilization. Individual human origins are irrelevant. The missing first generation also explains why human mortality is treated as a condition imposed later rather than as an original state. Early rulers live impossibly long lives. Humans exist closer to the divine. Over time, limits are introduced, lifespans shorten, boundaries harden. This sequence suggests that humanity begins in a state closer to order, and then moves away from it, not the other way around. Humanity does not start primitive and become civilized. It starts aligned and becomes constrained. This inversion challenges modern evolutionary narratives, but it is consistent within the Sumerian worldview. The past is not inferior. It is superior. The earliest humans are not less capable. They are closer to the source of order. This closeness may be why the first generation is not described. They exist in a realm that blends myth and structure. Describing them as individuals would reduce their significance. They are not characters. They are conditions. The flood narratives reinforce this idea. The flood does not create humanity anew. It preserves a remnant. Humanity survives not to rediscover civilization, but to continue it. After the flood, people already know how to farm, build, and worship. Civilization resumes quickly. There is no post-flood learning phase. The world does not need to be reinvented. This implies that knowledge survives catastrophe intact. It is preserved either through divine memory, human transmission, or both. This continuity further erases the idea of a first generation. Humanity exists as a continuous role rather than as a lineage of learners. As long as humans fulfill their function, their origin is secondary. The way humans are described linguistically supports this. The Sumerian term for humanity often emphasizes collective identity rather than individual distinction. Humans are referred to as a group defined by their relationship to labor and gods, not by ancestry. This collective framing reduces interest in beginnings. One does not ask when a function began. One asks whether it is being fulfilled. This is why the texts spend more time describing obligations than origins. Human duties are detailed. Their creation is summarized. What matters is what humans must do now. This emphasis also explains why failure is treated as moral rather than developmental. Humans do not fail because they are inexperienced. They fail because they disobey, neglect, or overstep. Punishment restores order. It does not educate in a modern sense. Education itself follows this logic. Humans are taught correct practice, not new possibilities. Learning is alignment, not exploration. The missing first generation is therefore not a mystery to be solved, but a consequence of a worldview that does not value beginnings as explanatory tools. Humanity's significance lies in its role, not its origin. This worldview also affects how humans are positioned relative to animals. Animals are not portrayed as precursors to humanity. They are parallel creations with different functions. Humans do not evolve out of animals. They are created for labor and ritual. Animals are created for sustenance, symbolism, and balance. There is no evolutionary ladder. There is a functional distribution. This distribution further reduces interest in a first generation. Humanity does not emerge from a previous state. It is assigned a place. This assignment makes humanity inherently responsible. Humans cannot claim ignorance. They cannot plead youth. From the beginning, they are expected to know what is required of them. This expectation may explain the harshness of some divine judgments. Humans are punished not because they fail to learn, but because they fail to remember. Forgetting is the true danger. Memory preserves order. Writing exists in part to support this memory. It records what humans must remember to remain aligned. It does not record how humans learned these things. This is why the first humans never speak in the texts. They are not voices of discovery. They are silent bearers of function. The texts speak around them, not through them. Later figures, such as kings and sages, gain voices because they mediate between humanity and order. They interpret, they enforce, they restore. The first humans do none of this. They simply are. This silence is consistent across genres. Myths do not dramatize early human confusion. Administrative texts do not reflect early inefficiency. Ritual texts do not mention primitive practice. Everything begins at competence. This competence is not accidental. It reflects an assumption that the world is already intelligible when humans arrive. The gods have already structured reality. Humanity enters into a world that makes sense. This makes the beginning of humanity indistinct from the beginning of order itself. To describe one would require describing the other. The texts avoid both. Instead, they focus on maintaining the relationship between humans and order. When that relationship breaks down, disaster follows. When it is restored, civilization continues. This pattern suggests that the true danger is not ignorance of origins, but loss of alignment. The past matters not because it is a beginning, but because it holds the correct form. The missing first generation is therefore not a gap in the story. It is a sign that the story is not about becoming, but about maintaining. Humanity is not on a journey toward civilization. It is placed within civilization and tested on whether it can sustain it. This perspective removes the drama of human ascent and replaces it with the weight of responsibility. Humans are not heroes discovering a world. They are stewards preserving one. This stewardship begins immediately. There is no probationary period. There is no learning curve recorded in the texts. Humanity begins at the moment it is capable of fulfilling its purpose. This immediacy reinforces the sense that civilization did not grow out of humanity. Humanity was shaped to fit civilization. As the narrative continues, this assumption will continue to shape how humans are judged, limited, and remembered. Humanity's story will not be about where it came from, but about how well it fulfills the role it was given. The absence of a first generation is therefore not an absence of meaning. It is a concentration of meaning. Humanity begins not in uncertainty, but in obligation. And once obligation is established, the need for an origin story fades. Civilization does not ask how humanity started. It asks whether humanity remembers what it is meant to do. When Sumerian creation stories are read with care, one detail stands out with unusual clarity. They do not begin at the beginning. They open only after structure already exists. Heaven and earth are already distinguishable. Waters already have presence and force. Divine roles are already emerging. What is described is not the birth of existence itself, but the organization of something that is already there. This is not a narrative oversight or a fragmentary loss. It is a consistent pattern that reveals how creation was understood. Creation, in these texts, does not mean bringing something into existence from nothing. It means shaping, arranging, and stabilizing what already exists into a form that can function. The stories begin at the moment when structure becomes possible, not at the moment of absolute origin. The earlier Sumerian cosmological descriptions speak of primordial waters, undifferentiated and all-encompassing, but these waters are not treated as non-existence. They are treated as presence without distinction. The world does not emerge out of emptiness. It emerges out of excess. The The problem is not absence. The problem is lack of order. This framing immediately removes the need for a true beginning. If something always existed in some form, then creation is not an act of invention. It is an act of division. Heaven is separated from earth. Fresh water is distinguished from salt water. Air is introduced between realms. Boundaries appear. Roles become possible. Creation stories therefore begin at the point where differentiation starts to matter. They begin when relationships can be defined. Before that, there is nothing to narrate, because narration itself depends on distinction. A world without structure cannot be described meaningfully. It has no reference points. This explains why the gods do not appear as originators of substance. They appear as agents of separation and assignment. Their power lies in imposing limits. They decide where something ends and something else begins. In doing so, they make function possible. Human creation follows the same logic. Humans are not created at the start of existence. They are created after the world already demands maintenance. Fields need tending, canals need cleaning, temples need support. The system strains under its own complexity. Only then does humanity appear. This sequence is crucial. Humanity is not the foundation of the world. Humanity is a response to structure. Humans are created because order already exists and must be sustained. Creation of humans comes late, not early. This lateness explains why creation stories start after structure exists. The stories are not about origins in the modern sense. They are about justification. They explain why things are the way they are now, not how they first came to be. A creation story in this context is an explanation of roles. It tells the listener why humans labour, why gods rule, why cities exist, why death occurs, why limits are imposed. It does not tell the listener how the universe came into existence. That question lies outside the scope of practical meaning. This practical orientation reflects the needs of a functioning civilization. People do not need to know how existence began in an abstract sense. They need to know how to live within it. Creation stories provide that guidance by explaining structure, not origin. This is why creation narratives often appear embedded within other texts rather than standing alone. They are invoked to explain a condition, a rule, or a consequence. They justify why something is required, forbidden, or limited. They are explanatory tools, not speculative histories. The placement of creation stories also reflects this function. They often appear after descriptions of divine labour, conflict, or imbalance. Creation happens to resolve a problem. Humans are created to relieve the gods. Boundaries are imposed to prevent chaos. Mortality is introduced to control population. Each creative act responds to a situation that already exists. Nothing is created in isolation. Every act is contextual. This makes the idea of a first moment unnecessary. There is always something before that requires adjustment. This pattern also explains why creation stories are often cyclical. They do not describe a single, irreversible beginning. They describe repeated acts of ordering. The flood resets conditions. Afterward, limits are re-established. Creation is ongoing, not singular. In this worldview, structure is more fundamental than origin. A thing matters because of how it fits within the system, not because of when it first appeared. Creation stories therefore focus on relationships rather than timelines. This focus is visible in how genealogies function. Divine genealogies do not trace back to a first god in a way that resolves origin. They extend into abstraction. Names become conditions. Relationships become symbolic. The further back one goes, the less concrete the figures become. This abstraction protects the authority of structure. If origin were too clearly defined, it might be questioned. By leaving it indistinct, the system remains unquestionable. The same applies to human genealogies. Kings trace lineage not to explain human origin, but to legitimize authority. The past is used to reinforce the present, not to uncover beginnings. Creation stories therefore operate within a world that already assumes continuity. They explain why continuity exists and how it should be preserved. They do not attempt to locate a starting point. This approach also reflects how time is perceived. Time is not a straight line from nothing to something. It is a series of cycles, corrections, and renewals. Creation is not an event. It is a process of maintenance. This maintenance requires explanation whenever it imposes hardship. Human labour, mortality, suffering, and limitation all require justification. Creation stories provide that justification by showing that these conditions are necessary for order. Without structure, creation stories would have no purpose. They exist to explain why structure is the way it is. They begin only once structure exists, because only then does explanation become necessary. This also explains why creation stories are rarely optimistic in a modern sense. They are not celebrations of possibility. They are acknowledgements of constraint. Humans are created because the gods are tired. Death is imposed because humans multiply too much. Limits exist because order is fragile. Creation is therefore associated with burden rather than freedom. It introduces responsibility. It defines obligation. It places humanity within a system that expects compliance. This framing removes the romance from beginnings. There is no golden dawn of humanity discovering itself. There is a sober assignment of roles. Creation is administrative. This administrative nature aligns with the broader tone of Sumerian writing. Lists, laws, and rituals dominate the record. Creation stories fit comfortably within this environment because they explain why the lists exist, why the laws apply, and why the rituals matter. They do not disrupt the world by introducing radical novelty. They reinforce it by anchoring practice in divine decision. This is why creation stories often feel incomplete to modern readers. We expect a beginning. The texts offer a justification. The mismatch creates frustration only if we impose modern expectations on ancient material. Within the Sumerian worldview, creation stories are complete. They answer the questions that matter. They explain why humans labour, why gods rule, why death exists, why limits are imposed, and why order must be maintained. They do not answer how existence began because that question does not affect how life should be lived. This functional approach also explains why multiple creation stories can coexist without contradiction. They are not competing explanations of origin. They are situational explanations of structure. Each addresses a different aspect of order. One story explains why humans were created. Another explains why mortality exists. Another explains why certain gods hold authority. Together they form a web of justification rather than a single timeline. This web does not require a starting point. It requires coherence. The absence of a true beginning therefore reflects confidence in the structure itself. The world works. Civilization functions. Order exists. Creation stories explain how that order was arranged, not how existence emerged from nothing. This perspective also protects civilization from existential doubt. If civilization depends on human invention, it can be questioned or undone. If it depends on cosmic order, it must be maintained. Creation stories reinforce this obligation. They remind humans that their role is not optional. It was assigned deliberately. It exists for a reason. This reason is never framed as human fulfillment. It is framed as balance. Humans exist to maintain a system that benefits gods and world alike. This maintenance-focused creation removes the need for a heroic origin. Humanity is not celebrated for beginning something new. Humanity is burdened with sustaining what already exists. As the narrative continues, this logic will carry forward. Disasters will occur when structure is ignored. Restoration will follow when structure is respected. Creation will be invoked whenever limits need explanation. The beginning will remain distant, unspoken, and unnecessary. Creation stories start after structure exists, because structure is the point. The world is not explained by how it began, but by how it is held together. And once that principle is accepted, the absence of a true beginning is no longer a mystery. It is the natural consequence of a worldview that values order over origin, continuity over novelty, and function over invention. The texts speak from inside a world that already works. Creation stories exist to explain why it must keep working that way. In the Sumerian tradition, the flood does not function as a beginning. It functions as a boundary. This distinction is easy to miss because later cultures often treat flood stories as origins, as moments when the world is wiped clean and restarted. The Sumerian texts do something more restrained and far more revealing. They use the flood to separate two conditions of existence, not to explain how existence itself began. Before the flood, the world is described as different, but not unfinished. Cities exist. Kings rule. The gods interact more directly with humanity. Lifespans stretch beyond ordinary limits. Order is present, but it operates under looser constraints. After the flood, the world continues, but under new limits. Mortality becomes fixed. Human population is regulated. Distance between gods and humans increases. Civilization resumes, but it does so within narrower boundaries. The flood, then, is not an act of creation. It is an act of adjustment. This is why the flood occupies such a central position in the Sumerian narrative structure. It marks a line that cannot be crossed backward in memory. Everything before it belongs to a different register of time. Everything after it belongs to history as it can be remembered, counted and recorded. The flood does not explain where civilization came from. It explains why civilization now exists under constraint. This role as a boundary is reinforced by how the flood is introduced in the texts. It is not framed as the first catastrophe, nor as the first divine intervention. It is framed as a response to imbalance. Humanity has grown too numerous. Human activity has become too loud. The functioning world, which had already been established, becomes strained. The gods do not decide to create something new. They decide to reduce, reset, and regulate what already exists. This motivation matters. The flood is not triggered by ignorance, moral corruption, in a modern sense, or failure to invent civilization correctly. It is triggered by excess. Humanity has succeeded too well. Civilization functions too effectively. The world becomes crowded, noisy, and difficult to govern. The flood becomes a corrective measure. Because of this, the flood does not erase structure. It temporarily overwhelms it. The waters cover cities, but the idea of cities remains intact. Kingship disappears briefly, but it is not abolished. It returns. Temples are destroyed, but their sacred status persists. The flood clears space, not meaning. This is why the survivors are not chosen to rebuild civilization from nothing. They are chosen to carry it forward. The instructions given to the flood survivor are not instructions for discovery. They are instructions for preservation. Preserve life. Preserve animals. Preserve seed. Preserve continuity. The emphasis on seed is especially important. Seed represents future repetition, not future innovation. To preserve seed is to ensure that what existed before can exist again. Nothing new is required, only survival. This logic makes the flood the perfect narrative boundary. It explains why the earliest remembered world already appears complete. The flood separates remembered order from an earlier, less bounded condition that is no longer accessible in detail. The texts do not need to describe the true beginning of civilization, because the flood already functions as the furthest meaningful point of reference. Beyond the flood lies a world that cannot be described in ordinary terms. Time behaves differently. Lifespans stretch beyond plausibility. Kings rule for impossibly long periods. The boundary between gods and humans is thinner. This is not history as the scribes understand it. It is a precondition. The flood allows the scribes to acknowledge that something existed before without needing to explain it fully. It creates a clean division. After the flood, time can be measured. Kings can be listed. Events can be dated. Before the flood, time is expansive, symbolic, and resistant to precise accounting. This distinction is reflected directly in the structure of the Sumerian king list. The list moves from the antediluvian kings, with their extraordinary reigns, to post-flood rulers whose reigns gradually become more realistic. The flood does not begin kingship. It normalizes it. Kingship exists before the flood. It descends from heaven. It functions in cities. What the flood changes is the scale. Authority becomes more human. Power becomes more limited. History becomes more granular. The flood also explains why early texts do not describe the invention of writing, agriculture, or cities. These things are assumed to exist on both sides of the boundary. What changes is not their existence, but their condition. Before the flood, knowledge seems closer to its source. After the flood, knowledge must be preserved actively. Writing becomes essential. Memory becomes fragile. Loss becomes possible. This makes the flood a justification for writing itself. After the flood, the world requires records because continuity is no longer guaranteed by proximity to divine order. Humans must remember deliberately. Writing emerges as a response to limitation. In this sense, the flood marks the beginning of historical consciousness, not of civilization. Civilization already existed. What begins after the flood is the need to document it. This explains why the flood narrative appears so frequently as a reference point. It anchors memory. It explains why things are the way they are now. It accounts for mortality, labour, hierarchy, and distance from the gods. It also provides a reason why the true beginning of civilization cannot be described. That beginning lies beyond the boundary, in a time when human memory was not yet constrained, and therefore not yet in need of writing. The flood creates a world where forgetting becomes dangerous. Before the flood, forgetting is less of a concern because order is more immediate. After the flood, forgetting threatens collapse. Writing becomes the defense against that threat. This is why the flood narrative is not celebratory. It is somber. It acknowledges loss, not renewal. The world after the flood is safer in some ways, but it's also more limited. Humans live shorter lives. Gods withdraw. Structure becomes more rigid. The flood introduces permanence of limits. Mortality becomes fixed. Population control becomes necessary. Human suffering becomes normalized. These are not punishments alone. They are stabilizers. The flood therefore explains why civilization appears already formed in the earliest post-flood texts. Civilization did not need to be reinvented. It needed to be constrained. This constraint-focused logic also explains why later catastrophes are framed differently. Wars, famines, and plagues disrupt order, but they do not redefine it. The flood stands apart because it changes the conditions under which order operates. By positioning the flood as a boundary rather than a beginning, the Sumerian texts avoid the need for a foundational origin story. Civilization does not start after the flood. Civilization continues after the flood under new rules. This continuity reinforces the idea that civilization belongs to the structure of the world itself, not to any single historical moment. The flood does not create civilization. It reveals its resilience. The narrative function of the flood also helps explain why the texts grow quieter about earlier times. Before the flood, events blur into symbolic time. After the flood, events become countable. The boundary simplifies memory. This simplification is essential for administration, law, and record keeping. A world without boundaries is difficult to manage. The flood creates the conditions for management. In this way, the flood serves as a narrative tool that allows the scribes to acknowledge deep antiquity without needing to explain it. Everything essential to their lived world exists on the near side of the boundary. Everything beyond it belongs to a different mode of existence. This is why the flood is remembered so clearly while the true beginning is not. The flood explains the present. The beginning does not. The flood also resolves a potential contradiction. If civilization is inherited and divinely ordered, why does it feel fragile? Why does it fail? The flood provides an answer. Order can be overwhelmed, but it is not erased. Restoration is always possible because the structure remains. This logic removes the need for a story of human ascent. Humanity does not rise from chaos. Humanity survives catastrophe and adapts to constraint. The flood marks the moment when adaptation becomes necessary. After the flood, humans must work harder to maintain order. Lifespans shorten. Resources become limited. Memory must be preserved intentionally. This makes the post-flood world the only world that truly needs explanation. Creation stories, laws, and rituals are all responses to post-flood conditions. They explain why life is difficult, structured, and constrained. The pre-flood world, by contrast, is not explained because it does not resemble lived experience. It is too distant, too expansive, too close to the divine. The flood, therefore, protects the narrative from overreach. It allows the text to remain grounded in practical concerns. It prevents speculation about origins from becoming central. By placing the flood at the centre rather than at the beginning, the Sumerian tradition frames history as a story of limits rather than of progress. The past is not primitive, it is excessive. The present is not triumphant, it is managed. This management-focused worldview fits perfectly with the broader tone of the texts. Civilization is something to be maintained carefully, not celebrated as an achievement. The flood teaches that too much success can be dangerous. Too many people, too much noise, too much activity can strain the system. Limits are necessary. These limits define the world the scribes inhabit. They explain why writing matters, why law matters, why ritual precision matters. The flood is therefore not a story about how civilization began. It is a story about why civilization must be controlled. As a narrative boundary, it separates an unbounded past from a bounded present. It marks the point where memory becomes essential and order becomes fragile. The true beginning of civilization lies somewhere beyond that boundary, in a world the texts acknowledge but refuse to describe in detail. That refusal is not ignorance, it is restraint. The flood draws a line and says, everything that matters to us begins here, not because nothing existed before, but because this is where explanation becomes necessary. Beyond the flood lies a world too close to order itself, too fluid, too expansive to be captured by writing. On this side of the flood lies history, responsibility, and the need to remember. And so the flood stands not as a beginning, but as a threshold. Civilization does not start when the waters recede. Civilization continues, altered, limited, and in need of constant care. That is why the flood is remembered, and the true beginning is not. When the Sumerian texts speak of the flood and the world that follows it, they do not linger on what was gained. They linger quietly and indirectly on what was lost. This loss is not catalogued in lists or described in lamentations as a complete inventory. It is implied through absence, through changes in scale, through limits that suddenly exist where none were emphasized before. History resets, but it does not restart cleanly. Something essential does not return. One of the most immediate losses is proximity. Before the flood, the distance between gods and humans appears narrower. Divine figures move more freely among cities. Communication feels less formal, less mediated. After the flood, interaction becomes structured, ritualized, and constrained. Access to the divine requires correct performance, proper timing, and institutional authority. What is lost is immediacy. This loss reshapes religious life. Temples remain, but their role changes subtly. They become points of controlled access rather than shared space. The gods are still present, but they are less approachable. Human voices no longer reach them directly. They must be amplified through sacrifice, prayer, and prescribed words. Silence replaces familiarity. Another loss concerns time itself. Before the flood, time stretches. Lifespans are vast. Reigns last tens of thousands of years. Memory does not feel urgent. After the flood, time compresses. Lifespans shorten dramatically. Generations turn over quickly. Memory becomes fragile. This compression changes everything. When time is abundant, forgetting carries little risk. When time is short, forgetting becomes dangerous. Knowledge must be preserved deliberately. Writing becomes necessary not because civilization is new, but because it is vulnerable. What is lost, then, is the luxury of continuity without effort. After the flood, continuity must be enforced. Institutions arise not to create order, but to protect it from erosion. The loss of longevity also alters authority. Early rulers exist closer to the divine. Their extended reigns suggest stability, continuity, and sustained alignment. After the flood, kings rule for decades rather than millennia. Authority fragments more easily. Dynasties rise and fall with increasing speed. This shift does not imply improvement. It implies instability. Power becomes something that must be reasserted repeatedly. Legitimacy must be reinforced through ritual, inscription, and force. Kingship remains, but it becomes heavier, more burdensome, more exposed to failure. The flood also marks a loss of completeness. Before the reset, the world feels less constrained by scarcity. The texts imply abundance without emphasizing struggle. After the reset, labour becomes central, work intensifies. The gods impose limits on reproduction, lifespan, and productivity. Human existence becomes defined by effort. This loss of ease is not framed as punishment alone. It is framed as necessity. The world cannot sustain unbounded success. Limits are introduced to preserve balance. But something is sacrificed in the process. The earlier condition, whatever it was, is no longer accessible. This inaccessibility is crucial. The texts do not offer a path back. There is no ritual to restore pre-flood conditions. There is no promise that humanity can return to longer life or closer proximity to the gods. The reset is permanent. This permanence explains why the flood functions as such a powerful boundary. It does not merely divide time, it seals it. The past before the flood is not a stage humanity can revisit. It is a closed world. What is lost, then, is not just a set of conditions, but a mode of existence. Humanity moves from participation in a loosely ordered world to stewardship of a tightly regulated one. Another loss concerns knowledge itself. Before the flood, knowledge appears less fragmented. The texts imply a coherence that does not need explanation. After the flood, knowledge must be categorized, listed, and defended. Writing becomes more systematic, lists proliferate, classification intensifies. This suggests a loss of intuitive alignment. Humans can no longer rely on closeness to order. They must reconstruct it through memory. Knowledge shifts from lived understanding to recorded instruction. This shift introduces error. Once knowledge must be written, it can be miswritten. Once it must be copied, it can be altered. Preservation becomes an active struggle. The possibility of distortion appears. This is why scribal discipline becomes so strict. Precision matters because loss has already occurred. The system must compensate. The flood also reshapes how failure is understood. Before the reset, imbalance leads to correction at a cosmic scale. After the reset, imbalance leads to localized collapse. Cities fall, dynasties end. Suffering becomes more frequent and more contained. This localization of failure changes moral responsibility. Humans are now held accountable within narrower limits. Disobedience leads to punishment that does not reset the world, but damages parts of it. Responsibility feels heavier because the consequences are more immediate. What is lost here is the buffering effect of divine proximity. The gods intervene less directly. Their decisions echo more slowly. Humans feel the weight of their actions more acutely. The flood also removes a certain transparency. Before the reset, divine decisions appear clearer, even if harsh. Afterward, interpretation becomes necessary. Omens must be read, signs must be decoded, meaning becomes indirect. This introduces uncertainty. Humans no longer know exactly what the gods want at every moment. They must infer. Priests gain importance because they mediate uncertainty. Rituals become more elaborate because clarity has been lost. This loss of clarity further distances humanity from origin. The earlier world may have been dangerous, but it was intelligible. The post-flood world is safer in some ways, but more opaque. The loss is also visible in how history itself is recorded. After the flood, history becomes segmented. Reigns are counted, events are dated, records accumulate. Before the flood, time resists counting. It stretches beyond practical measure. This shift transforms memory. Pre-flood time becomes symbolic. Post-flood time becomes administrative. What is lost is continuity across the boundary. Memory fractures. This fracture explains why the true beginning of civilization cannot be recovered. Whatever existed before the flood is not merely forgotten, it is structurally unreachable. The conditions required to remember it no longer exist. This does not mean the Sumerians believed nothing of value existed before the flood. On the contrary, the extraordinary lifespans and reigns suggest reverence. The past is not inferior, it is overwhelming. But reverence does not equal accessibility. The reset removes humanity's ability to live in that condition. The past becomes something to respect, not to replicate. The loss of scale is another subtle consequence. Before the flood, human actions feel less consequential because time absorbs them. After the flood, actions carry weight because time is short. History accelerates. This acceleration makes innovation riskier. Changes have immediate effects. Mistakes propagate quickly. Stability becomes harder to maintain. This may explain the conservative tone of post-flood culture. Preservation becomes the highest value. Novelty becomes suspect. The system cannot absorb disruption easily anymore. What is lost, then, is tolerance for deviation. The earlier world could withstand more excess. The later world demands discipline. The flood also redefines humanity's relationship with death. Mortality becomes fixed. Death is no longer an exception or a distant outcome. It becomes central to human experience. This changes motivation, fear, and ambition. Death introduces urgency. Urgency reshapes culture. Writing becomes a way to outlast mortality. Monuments become attempts at permanence. Legacy replaces longevity. This replacement is itself a loss. Living long enough to witness continuity firsthand is no longer possible. Continuity must be imagined rather than experienced. The loss of first-hand continuity may explain the rise of genealogy and kingship lists. These records simulate continuity across generations. They are substitutes for lived memory. The flood also alters how blame is distributed. Before the reset, humanity's excess triggers divine action. Afterward, humans are blamed for misfortune even when structural limits are responsible. Responsibility shifts downward. This shift creates moral tension. Humans must maintain a system that is already more fragile than before. Failure feels personal even when it is systemic. The texts do not dwell on this tension explicitly, but it is present in their structure. Laws multiply, ritual precision increases, administrative oversight expands. These are responses to loss. The loss is not named because it cannot be repaired. Naming it would imply the possibility of return. The texts avoid that implication. Instead, the loss is acknowledged indirectly, through emphasis on maintenance, control, and memory. Civilization becomes a practice rather than a condition. The flood transforms civilization from something that exists naturally into something that must be upheld actively. This is perhaps the most significant loss of all. Before the reset, order exists with less effort. Afterward, order requires constant attention. Neglect has consequences. This shift explains why the earliest post-flood texts feel so serious, so administrative, so focused on correctness. Civilization has become work. The loss also reframes the role of humanity. Humans are no longer participants in a loosely ordered cosmos. They are caretakers of a system that can fail. This caretaking role is heavy. It demands obedience, memory, and discipline. It leaves little room for reflection on beginnings. The flood removes not only access to the past, but interest in it. Survival in the present becomes the priority. This is why the true beginning of civilization fades completely after the reset. The world no longer has the capacity to remember it meaningfully. The structure that supported such memory no longer exists. The loss is not tragic in the narrative sense. It is accepted. The texts do not mourn it openly. They adapt. Adaptation becomes the defining feature of post-flood humanity. Limits are accepted, systems are refined, memory is externalized. This acceptance is quiet but profound. It marks the transition from mythic time to historical time. History in this sense is born not at the beginning, but after loss. It begins when something can no longer be recovered. The flood resets history by removing access to origin. What follows is a world that must function without it. Civilization continues, but it does so without the ability to look back fully. It moves forward carrying a sense of something diminished, even if unnamed. This unnamed loss shapes everything that follows. It justifies law, ritual, hierarchy, and writing. It explains why order must be enforced rather than assumed. The reset does not simplify the world, it complicates it. It introduces fragility where there was once scale. What is lost when history is reset is not merely a past era. It is a way of existing that no longer fits within the limits now imposed. And once those limits exist, civilization cannot afford to dwell on what came before. It must focus on what can still be maintained. The flood closes a door that was never meant to be reopened. Beyond it lies a world that gave rise to civilization without leaving instructions. On this side of the boundary, humanity works, remembers and records, not to rediscover that world, but to survive without it. That is the true cost of the reset. Civilization endures, but it does so carrying a loss it can no longer articulate, only compensate for through order, discipline and memory. The Sumerian record draws a quiet but decisive line between civilization itself and whatever conditions allowed it to exist in the first place. This distinction is never stated directly, but it governs the entire structure of the texts. Civilization is described in detail, its origin is not. The two are treated as fundamentally different kinds of things, and this difference explains why one is preserved so carefully while the other fades into silence. Civilization, as the text present it, is a functioning system. It consists of cities, temples, laws, kingship, labour, ritual, and memory. It can be managed, repaired, restored, and regulated. It can succeed or fail. It can be disrupted and brought back into alignment. It is something humans participate in actively, something that requires constant attention. Its origin, by contrast, is not treated as a system at all. It is not something that can be managed or revisited. It is not something humans can interact with. It lies outside the operational world the texts are concerned with. Whatever gave rise to civilization is not described as a process that can be repeated or understood through administration or ritual. This separation changes how history is written. The Sumerian texts are intensely practical. They record what must be done, who must do it, and under what authority. Civilization belongs to this practical domain. Its origin does not. The origin belongs to a different category of reality, one that resists practical engagement. This is why civilization is narrated continuously, while origin is not narrated at all. Civilization exists within time as the Sumerians experience it. It has duration, rhythm, and consequence. Origin exists outside that time. It precedes measurement. It does not fit into reigns, cycles, or lists. The flood makes this distinction visible. After the flood, civilization resumes and can be recorded. Before the flood, conditions exist that resemble civilization, but operate on a different scale. The origin lies even further back, beyond even that. The texts acknowledge that something existed before, but they do not attempt to collapse that existence into history. This restraint is deliberate. To describe origin as part of civilization would imply that civilization emerged through the same mechanisms it now operates by. The texts resist this implication. Civilization is maintained by labour, authority, and memory. Its origin is not attributed to labour, authority, or memory. This explains why gods establish order, but are rarely depicted as discovering civilization. They arrange, assign, and regulate, but they do not narrate a moment when civilization first appears. Order seems to exist as a condition that can be activated rather than created. In this framework, civilization is not the cause of order. It is an expression of order under specific conditions. When those conditions change, civilization changes, but order itself remains intact. The origin of civilization therefore lies in order, not in human action. This distinction allows the text to focus on responsibility rather than explanation. Humans are responsible for civilization because it exists within their capacity to maintain. Humans are not responsible for its origin because that lies beyond their reach. The same logic applies to kingship. Kings exercise authority within civilization. They do not originate authority itself. Authority descends. Civilization receives it and organizes itself around it. The origin of authority remains separate from its administration. Writing follows the same pattern. Writing preserves civilization. It does not explain how civilization came into being. Writing begins once civilization needs reinforcement. It does not reach back to the moment of emergence. This separation protects civilization from fragility. If civilization depended on remembering its origin, forgetting that origin would threaten its legitimacy. By anchoring legitimacy in order rather than origin, civilization remains stable even when origins are unknown. The texts reinforce this stability by treating civilization as something that can be restored after catastrophe. Cities can be rebuilt, kingship can return, laws can be reinstated. None of this requires knowing how civilization began. It only requires knowing how it functions. This functional emphasis makes origin irrelevant to survival. Civilization persists as long as its structures are maintained. Its origin does not need to be recalled for it to continue. This perspective also explains why origin myths do not accumulate detail over time. Later Mesopotamian cultures do not add clarity to the beginning. They inherit the same silence. They elaborate on gods, laws, and rituals, but they do not attempt to reconstruct the first moment of civilization. The silence is preserved because it serves a purpose. It keeps the focus on alignment rather than ancestry. Civilization is legitimate because it aligns with cosmic order, not because it can trace its birth. This distinction also affects how change is interpreted. Changes within civilization are meaningful. They can be judged, corrected, or reversed. Changes to the conditions that allowed civilization to exist are treated as catastrophic. The flood alters conditions, not just practices. The origin belongs to the realm of conditions. Civilization belongs to the realm of practice. The texts operate almost exclusively in the latter. This helps explain why the Sumerians could imagine a world before humanity, without imagining a world before order. Humanity enters a structured environment. Civilization emerges when humanity is placed within that structure in a sustained way. The origin of that structure is not addressed because it does not belong to human time. The difference between civilization and its origin is therefore not chronological alone, it is categorical. Civilization is something humans do. Its origin is something humans inherit without access. This inheritance does not come with instructions about beginnings. It comes with expectations about maintenance. Humans are not asked to understand where civilization came from. They are asked to keep it functioning. This expectation shapes moral judgment. Humans are blamed for disorder not because they failed to invent civilization correctly, but because they failed to uphold it. Responsibility begins after origin. This also explains why nostalgia for origins is absent. The texts do not idealize a founding moment. They idealize proper functioning. The past is valued for its alignment, not for its novelty. The origin remains abstract because abstraction preserves authority. If the origin were concrete, it could be challenged or reinterpreted. By remaining distant, it remains unquestionable. This distance also protects the gods. Their authority does not rest on a specific creative act that could be scrutinized. It rests on their ongoing role in maintaining order. The result is a worldview in which civilization feels solid and ancient even when it is historically young. Its youth is irrelevant. Its alignment is what matters. This alignment allows civilization to be described, regulated, and repaired without reference to its beginning. It exists in the present tense of obligation. The difference between civilization and its origin therefore explains the central silence of the Sumerian record. The texts do not omit the beginning by accident. They exclude it by necessity. To include origin would collapse a boundary that gives civilization meaning. Civilization functions because it operates within limits. Its origin lies beyond those limits. This boundary is maintained consistently. Writing begins after civilization is already working. Cities are described once they are established. Kings rule after authority descends. Humans appear once labour is required. Everything important begins after structure exists. Everything that comes before structure remains unspoken. This is not ignorance, it is discipline. The Sumerian texts discipline attention toward what can be maintained. They turn away from what cannot be recovered. Civilization belongs to memory. Its origin belongs to condition. Memory can be recorded. Condition cannot. This distinction ensures that civilization remains actionable. Humans can act within it. They can preserve it. They can repair it. They cannot recreate its origin, and they are not asked to try. The absence of origin therefore becomes a stabilizing force. It prevents speculation from undermining responsibility. It keeps focus on duty rather than curiosity. As the record continues, this separation remains intact. Civilization unfolds, adapts, and survives without ever needing to explain how it first appeared. The true beginning remains beyond reach, not because it was lost, but because it was never meant to be part of the story civilization tells about itself. Silence in the Sumerian record is not an absence waiting to be filled. It is a practice. Over time, it becomes the most consistent element in the tradition itself. While cities rise and fall, gods gain and lose prominence, and political power shifts from one dynasty to another, the silence around beginnings remains intact. It is preserved with remarkable discipline. This silence does not appear suddenly. It is reinforced gradually through repetition, omission, and habit. Each generation of scribes inherits not only texts, but also the boundaries of what is worth recording. Those boundaries harden over time. What is not written becomes just as authoritative as what is. The absence of a true beginning is therefore not a failure of memory. It is a memory of restraint. From the earliest tablets onward, scribes demonstrate a clear sense of where explanation should stop. They describe systems, roles, and obligations in detail, but they do not speculate about origins beyond what is necessary to justify present order. The pattern repeats so consistently that it becomes tradition. This tradition of silence is maintained even as writing evolves. As scripts change, languages shift, and literary forms expand, the core restraint remains. Later compositions build upon earlier frameworks without pushing backward into forbidden territory. The silence is inherited along with the text. This inheritance suggests that silence itself carried meaning. It was not simply that no one knew the beginning. It was that the beginning was not meant to be known in detail. To speak too clearly about it would disrupt the balance between what humans are responsible for and what lies beyond them. This restraint protects authority. If origins were fully described, they could be debated, interpreted, and potentially challenged. By leaving origins indistinct, authority remains anchored in order rather than narrative. Order does not need a story to justify itself. It simply must be upheld. Silence also protects continuity. In a civilization where stability depends on repetition, introducing speculative explanations about beginnings could create division. Different interpretations could lead to different practices. Silence avoids this risk. By not defining the beginning, the tradition allows the present to remain unified. People may disagree about details of ritual or administration, but they do not argue about where civilization came from. That question remains outside discourse. This is especially important in a culture that values correct practice over personal belief. The Sumerian record shows little interest in individual interpretation. What matters is doing things properly. Silence around origins keeps attention focused on action rather than speculation. This focus is reinforced through education. Scribal training does not include philosophical debate about beginnings. It includes copying lists, learning formulas, and mastering procedures. Students are taught what must be remembered, not what might be imagined. Through this process, silence becomes normalized. New scribes learn not only what to write, but what not to write. The boundary is transmitted quietly, without explanation. This boundary also appears in how myths are structured. Myths gesture toward deep time, but they do not linger there. They move quickly to the establishment of roles, conflicts, and consequences. The distant past is acknowledged and then left behind. This pattern suggests that silence is not empty. It is active. It directs attention forward, toward maintenance of order. Silence also functions as a form of humility. By refusing to explain origins fully, the texts acknowledge limits to human understanding. There are aspects of existence that are not accessible to human reasoning or record-keeping. Accepting this limitation is part of wisdom. This humility contrasts sharply with later traditions that seek comprehensive explanations of beginnings. The Sumerian approach is more cautious. It recognizes that explaining too much can destabilize meaning rather than clarify it. The silence also absorbs contradictions. Different myths present different sequences of events, different divine relationships, and different emphases. Because none of them claim to describe the absolute beginning, they can coexist without conflict. Silence allows plurality without collapse. This plurality is visible across Mesopotamian history. Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian texts adapt Sumerian material, reinterpret gods, and reshape narratives, yet they preserve the same silence around ultimate origins. The boundary holds. Over time, this silence becomes older than any specific text. It predates particular gods, cities, or kings. It becomes the most ancient tradition of all. This antiquity gives silence authority. Because it has always been there, it does not need justification. It is assumed, like gravity or time. No text needs to explain why the beginning is not described, it simply is not. This absence shapes how later readers experience the record. Modern scholars often approach the text searching for what is missing, assuming that absence indicates loss. Within the original worldview, absence indicates discipline. The silence also shapes how catastrophe is remembered. After disasters, the texts focus on restoration, not reflection. They do not ask how everything began again. They ask how to rebuild what should exist. This practical orientation reinforces silence. There is always work to be done. Speculation about origins does not feed people, maintain canals, or appease gods. Silence keeps attention on survival and order. The flood reinforces this discipline. It erases access to deep memory and makes silence permanent. After the flood, the past becomes fragmented. What remains is what can be managed. Silence fills the gap left by loss. This loss makes silence protective. It shields the present from being overwhelmed by an inaccessible past. The tradition does not pretend to know what cannot be recovered. Silence also preserves reverence. By not naming the beginning, the texts treat it as something too large to handle directly. It becomes sacred by remaining unnamed. This sacredness is not emotional or mystical. It is structural. The beginning belongs to the same realm as divine order itself. It is not something humans can manipulate. By keeping the beginning silent, the tradition maintains a clear hierarchy. Gods administer order. Humans maintain it. Origins remain above both. This hierarchy stabilizes society. Everyone knows their place. Questions that threaten to blur boundaries are avoided not through censorship, but through habit. Over centuries, this habit becomes invisible. Silence no longer feels like a choice. It feels like the natural state of things. This invisibility is the mark of a successful tradition. When restraint no longer needs explanation, it has become culture. The silence also affects how later myths are interpreted. Readers are guided to focus on function rather than sequence. What matters is why something exists now, not how it first appeared. This functional focus aligns with the broader worldview of maintenance over invention. Civilization is not a story of progress. It is a task that must be repeated correctly. Silence supports repetition by preventing distraction. Without an origin story to revisit or reinterpret, attention stays on ritual, law, and labour. This does not mean curiosity was absent. Humans undoubtedly wondered about beginnings, but the written tradition does not indulge those questions. It channels curiosity into correct practice. This channeling is a form of control, but also a form of care. By limiting what is asked, the tradition ensures coherence. The silence becomes a shared understanding. Everyone knows it exists. No one needs to name it. This shared understanding creates stability across time. Even as languages change and empires rise, the silence remains. The oldest tradition, then, is not a story, a ritual, or a law. It is a refusal to speak beyond a certain point. This refusal defines the shape of the entire record. It explains why civilization appears complete, why origins remain obscure, and why continuity matters more than explanation. Silence becomes the foundation upon which everything else rests. It holds together systems, beliefs, and practices without ever appearing explicitly. This foundation is strong precisely because it is not articulated. Articulating it would weaken it by turning it into something that could be argued over. By leaving the beginning unnamed, the tradition ensures that civilization remains anchored in order rather than narrative. As the record moves toward its later stages, this silence does not break, it deepens. It becomes so ingrained that it is no longer perceived as silence at all. It becomes the background against which all writing occurs. The Sumerian texts do not tell us where civilization truly began because they are not meant to. Their task is not to satisfy curiosity, but to preserve order. Silence is the mechanism that allows them to do that. It is the quiet rule that governs what can be said and what must remain beyond reach. And because it has been obeyed for as long as writing has existed, it becomes the oldest and most enduring tradition civilization ever created, without ever writing it down. As the record finally settles into silence, not because it has ended, but because it has reached the edge of what it is willing to say, one understanding remains. The beginning was never written because it was never meant to function as knowledge. Everything that survives in the Sumerian text survives because it can be maintained. The beginning cannot be maintained. It cannot be repaired, enforced, repeated, or restored. It exists outside the reach of responsibility, and therefore outside the reach of writing. When a civilization chooses not to write its beginning, it is making a decision about where meaning resides. Meaning does not live in how something started, it lives in how something continues. The Sumerian world does not define itself by origin, it defines itself by obligation. This is why the earliest tablets do not feel curious, they feel settled. They do not ask how the world came to be. They assume the world is already there, already ordered enough to require care. Writing enters at the moment when forgetting becomes dangerous, not at the moment when discovery becomes possible. The absence of a beginning does not weaken the record. It strengthens it. It removes distraction. It keeps attention fixed on what must be done now. Fields must be tended, canals must be cleared, offerings must be made correctly, laws must be enforced, kings must rule justly. Memory must be preserved. None of these tasks benefit from knowing how civilization began. All of them depend on knowing how civilization works. This focus creates a culture where the past is valued not for its novelty, but for its reliability. What matters is not that something happened first, but that it happened correctly and continues to be done correctly. The past is not a story of emergence, it is a template. The beginning, whatever it was, does not serve as a template. It cannot be repeated, it cannot be imitated, it cannot be tested. It belongs to a condition that no longer exists. This makes the beginning dangerous as an idea. If people were encouraged to dwell on origins, they might imagine alternatives. They might question whether the current order is necessary. They might ask whether things could be arranged differently. Silence prevents that drift. Silence anchors civilization to function rather than speculation. This is not the silence of ignorance. It is the silence of discipline. It is a boundary that protects coherence. Within this boundary, civilization can change without unraveling. Cities can rise and fall. Dynasties can collapse. Gods can shift in prominence. Writing can evolve. But the core understanding remains untouched. Civilization exists to be maintained, not explained. When the beginning is never written, authority does not depend on a founding moment. It depends on alignment. A king is legitimate because he upholds order, not because he traces his lineage to a first ruler. A city matters because it functions, not because it was founded heroically. A law is just because it restores balance, not because it originated in wisdom. This removes the fragility that origin stories often introduce. If legitimacy depends on a specific story, that story can be challenged. If legitimacy depends on function, it must be challenged through action, not narrative. The Sumerian record chooses the latter. The absence of the beginning also changes how loss is understood. When disasters occur, they do not threaten the identity of civilization itself. They threaten its condition. Restoration is always possible because the idea of civilization is not tied to a single moment that can be lost forever. This resilience is built into the structure of the texts. They are designed to survive collapse. They tell future generations how to rebuild, not how to remember a vanished dawn. This is why even the flood does not function as a beginning. It is a reset, not an origin. It changes conditions, not purpose. Civilization resumes because it was never defined by a starting point. The beginning remains beyond reach, not because it was erased, but because it was never meant to be used. This perspective invites a different kind of reflection. If civilization does not require an origin to justify itself, then perhaps the need to locate beginnings is a cultural habit rather than a necessity. Perhaps origins matter only when continuity feels uncertain. The Sumerians lived in a world where continuity felt fragile but manageable. Order could fail, but it could also be restored. What mattered was not knowing where everything came from, but knowing how to put it back into place. Writing exists for that purpose. It is a tool for restoration. It remembers what must be repeated. The beginning does not belong to repetition. It belongs to a state that cannot be returned to. By leaving it unwritten, the tradition accepts that limitation. This acceptance is quiet but profound. It suggests that some questions are not unanswered because they are difficult, but because they are unnecessary. The beginning of civilization is one of those questions. Civilization, as experienced by the Sumerians, was not something they felt they had stepped into recently. It was something they found themselves inside of, already operating, already demanding care. Their responsibility began not with invention, but with stewardship. That stewardship shaped everything they recorded. The absence of the beginning also shifts the weight of time. The future becomes more important than the past. Not the distant future of speculation, but the immediate future of continuity. Tomorrow matters because tomorrow requires order. The texts are written for that tomorrow. They instruct, they regulate, they remind. They do not inspire with tales of origins, they steady with reminders of obligation. This steadiness is why the record feels so calm, even when it describes catastrophe. There is no panic about identity. There is no existential doubt. Civilization is not at risk because its origin is unknown. Civilization is at risk only when its practices fail. This clarity allows the tradition to endure. Silence in this context is not emptiness. It is a support. It holds up the structure by refusing to overload it with explanations that cannot be acted upon. When the beginning is never written, the present carries more weight. Every action matters because there is no mythic starting point to retreat into. There is only the ongoing task. This may be why the Sumerian world feels so serious. There is little indulgence in imagination for its own sake. Even myth serves function. Even story serves order. The beginning, lacking function, remains silent. And yet that silence does not erase wonder. It transforms it. Wonder is no longer directed backward toward an unreachable past. It is directed outward toward the complexity of maintaining a world that already exists. There is wonder in the precision of ritual, wonder in the stability of cities built and rebuilt on the same ground, wonder in the continuity of lore across generations, wonder in the fact that civilization persists at all. This is a quieter wonder, one that does not need a dramatic origin story to sustain it. As sleep approaches, this quiet understanding lingers. Civilization does not begin when someone decides to start it. It begins when order exists, and someone takes responsibility for keeping it intact. The Sumerian texts speak from inside that responsibility. They do not look back to a first moment because their attention is fixed on what must continue. The beginning is not forgotten. It is set aside. It rests beyond writing, beyond memory, beyond obligation. And perhaps that is where it belongs. In the silence where explanation ends, the work continues. That is what it means when the beginning is never written. Not that it never existed, but that civilization chose to survive without needing to remember it. And in that choice, the record becomes what it has always been. Not a story of how the world started, but a guide for how it must be carried forward, one careful moment at a time, into the quiet continuity of another day, and then another, until the writing itself is no longer needed, and only the order remains.